The Missing Billionaire. Written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2019 by Christine Kersey. Chapter 1. On the hunt for the perfect couch for her design client, Chloe leaned closer to the screen of her laptop, resting her forearms on her desk as she scrolled through the website of a furniture store. Completely focused on her search, when her cell phone rang, she startled. The caller ID said it was Hannah, her best friend. Ready for a break, Chloe smiled as she picked up her phone and swiped to answer. "Hey there." "Are you watching the news?" Tilting her head as if Hannah could see her, she said, "Of course not. I'm working." "Turn on the news." The request was strange. Hannah knew Chloe didn't have time to watch TV at work, so there must be a reason. Holding back a sigh, Chloe asked, "Which channel?" "All of them. Any of them." Hannah almost seemed out of breath. What in the world could be so important that all the news channels would be covering it, and what would have Hannah so agitated? "Okay, hang on." Curious to find out what was going on, Chloe pulled up the website of her favorite news channel where they were broadcasting live. Her eyes widened and her mouth fell open, then she turned up the volume. "Calling it a miracle," the news anchor was saying. "The heir to Hewitt Consolidated, billionaire Nathan Hewitt, who has been missing and presumed dead for over a year, has been found." Chloe's ears began to buzz, and her vision went to pinpoints. "Chloe?" Hannah asked. "Are you there?" Her phone slipped out of her hand and landed softly on the carpeted floor. Finding it hard to catch her breath, Chloe squeezed her eyes closed and focused on the air going in and out of her lungs. "Breathe, Chloe," she thought. "Breathe. In and out. In and out." When she had gathered herself, she opened her eyes, her gaze skittering back to the news broadcast. The words the news anchor was saying about Nathan, marooned on a deserted island after his yacht had sunk, rescued by men on a fishing boat, barely slid into Chloe's brain. All the while, she stared at the screen as it showed Nathan. Not the stock photo the news station had shown when he and his yacht had gone missing 1 year earlier. No. This was a live shot of the man who was responsible for the death of Chloe's sister, and he looked fine. Okay, maybe he was a little thinner, but still, he was alive, unlike Lisa. Fury, powerful and swift, slammed through Chloe, replacing the shock she'd felt moments before. At the same time, she was stunned that Nathan had been found, and if she was honest with herself, she was a tiny bit relieved as well. Growing up, she and her younger sister Lisa had been best friends with Nathan, hanging out all the time. But 1 year earlier, when Chloe and Nathan were 23 and Lisa was 22, Nathan had decided to take an extended trip on his family's yacht, a cruise to celebrate his college graduation, and he'd asked Lisa to go with him. Only Lisa. Chloe had crushed on Nathan for years, so when he'd chosen her sister, a girl who was all about having a good time rather than having any kind of relationship, Chloe had been jealous and hurt. Why hadn't he invited her? Then again, it made sense. Nathan and Lisa were 2 peas in a pod, so alike that it only made sense that he'd chosen her. But then the yacht had vanished. Several weeks later, after an extensive search, the yacht, and Lisa's body, had been found. The body of the yacht's captain had been found as well. Both deaths were due to drowning, and when Nathan's body hadn't been found, everyone assumed he'd drowned as well. Now, though, seeing Nathan walking off of a plane, perfectly intact while her sister's remains were buried in the cold ground, Chloe wanted to storm over to the Hewitt mansion and confront Nathan. But the thought of facing him also sent her heart into a painful gallop, and she knew she wasn't ready to see the man whose face she had never been able to get out of her mind. Chapter 2. This was nothing like Nathan had imagined. He thought he would be ecstatic to come home, but as he walked inside his parents' house, accompanied by his hovering mother and stoic father, all he felt was guilt. And when he saw their staff, chef, housekeeper, driver, gardener, all lined up to greet him, he just felt awkward. "Welcome home, Nathan," his mother said as tears filled her eyes. "I never thought I'd have the opportunity to say those words again." Focusing on his parents, Nathan pushed a smile onto his lips. "I never thought I'd hear those words." He drew his mother into a warm embrace. "It's good to be home." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. "We left your room just as it was," his mother said after he released her. Nodding, he kept the smile plastered on his face. "I just couldn't," his mother began. Then she pressed her lips together as she shook her head. "Well, it doesn't matter now. All that matters is that you're home, safe and sound." Which was more than could be said of Lisa, but that wasn't something he could think about just then. Nathan glanced toward the staircase that led up to his wing of the mansion before facing his parents. "I'm going to head up, if that's all right." "Whatever you'd like," his mother said. With a final nod toward his parents he'd missed very much, he began walking toward the staircase. "Dinner will be served at 7, his mother called after him. The thought of someone cooking for him, waiting on him, it was something he'd gone without for the last year, and it was something he didn't think he deserved. "Right," he answered. When he entered his bedroom, it was as if time had stopped. He'd been living away from home while going to college, so this room reflected his high school years. The room was spacious, too spacious. Without consciously making the decision, he walked over to his closet and stepped inside. This is better, he thought. The closet was bigger than the cave he'd been living in on the island, but the cave hadn't had rows and rows of designer clothes on hangers. Despite that, his closet felt familiar. With a heavy sigh, he sank to the floor and stretched out his legs. Then he closed his eyes and leaned his head against the wall. An image of Lisa James filled his mind. Guilt swiftly followed. Guilt for surviving when she hadn't. Guilt that he'd taken her from her family. Guilt that he could never make it up to them. He desperately wished Lisa hadn't come on that cruise. And now he would have to face Chloe. Chapter 3. It had been just over a week since Chloe had heard about Nathan's return, and ever since seeing him on television, she'd struggled to get him out of her head. Hard as she tried, she kept seeing his face, when she fell asleep, when she woke up, when she was working. She needed to talk to him, needed to get her feelings off of her chest, needed to stop wasting so much mental energy on Nathan Hewitt. An hour later, Chloe found herself turning her car onto the street that ran in front of the Hewitts' Los Angeles residence. Catching a glimpse of the mansion through the trees that surrounded the grounds, she felt her heart going into overdrive. The last time she'd been there, she had been looking for Lisa, and that was when she'd found out that Lisa had gone with Nathan on the cruise. Chloe hadn't been back since. A gaggle of paparazzi stood smack dab in front of the imposing gate. Unsure now if she wanted to traverse the group, she slowed. All eyes turned to her, and a split second later she knew that they'd recognized her, the sister of the girl who had died on the Hewitts' yacht. The horde of photographers turned their cameras on her, and Chloe panicked, stomping on the gas pedal as she zoomed past the Hewitts' mansion. Frustrated that she hadn't been able to complete her mission, Chloe frowned, then drove back to her condo. Monday morning, Nathan woke early. He hadn't had a good night's sleep since the day he'd washed up on that deserted island. After working out in his family's extensive home gym, he showered before going into the kitchen where the Hewitt chef, Bernie, made him an omelet and toast. After the Herculean effort he'd had to make each and every day on the island to find food, it was beyond surreal to be able to ask for a delicious meal and have it appear in front of him as if by magic. Shoving down the sense of unreality that swept over him, Nathan took his breakfast out onto the wide back patio that had a wonderful view of green mountains, settling into one of the lounge chairs. Growing up in this house in the hills above Los Angeles, he'd always found the solitude of the backyard soothing, but not anymore, not after being completely alone for an entire year. Gritting his teeth, he stared at the tranquil view in an attempt to force himself to come to grips with being home, being back in society, being back to a normal life. But his life would never be normal. Not just because he was the only heir to a billion-dollar corporation that his father had started. He'd accepted that as normal when he was a small child. No, it was the notoriety he'd earned by being presumed dead before being found by a wayward fishing vessel. He would be forever grateful to those men who had noticed his frantic attempts to get their attention and had taken the time to investigate the huge bonfire on a small island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That ocean had tried to kill him, but he'd survived. He had to remember that. "Do you think you're ready to come into the office?" Nathan's father asked as he joined him on the veranda, sitting in an adjacent chair. Pushing aside his memories, Nathan turned to his father with a small smile. He'd been stewing in his memories, stewing in his guilt since he'd gotten home. But it was time to man up, time to work for a living, even if that living was beyond ridiculous. He'd always enjoyed the perks of being the son of a billionaire, but having every single thing taken away from him, being forced to survive by his very wits, had changed him, made him appreciate all that he had. There was no way he would sit around all day, mooching off of his parents. He'd finished college, had earned an MBA, and now he would put it to use. "Yeah," he said with a nod, "I think I am." His father smiled. "Good. Dmitri will drive you when you're ready." "I'm going to drive myself." His father's eyebrows shot up. "You may need to renew your license." Nathan smirked. "Because the DMV thinks I'm dead?" His father laughed. "Yes." The earlier sense of unreality returned, but he forced a smile. "Right." Standing, his father said, "I'm heading to the office now. I'll see you when you get there." With a nod, Nathan turned back to his breakfast. Chloe couldn't help it. On her way to work in downtown Los Angeles Monday morning, she made a slight detour to drive past the headquarters of Hewitt Consolidated. As she drove by, her gaze slid to the people entering the tall building. Was she looking for Nathan? Maybe, although she had no idea what she would do if she actually saw him. Didn't matter, because there was no sign of him. With a gentle sigh, she drove to work. After a busy morning, Chloe was ready for a break. Wanting to get away from the office and needing to stretch her legs, when lunchtime rolled around, she walked to a nearby deli. Taking her time eating her chicken salad sandwich, she let her thoughts roam freely, but like they always did lately, they ended up on Nathan. Maybe she would try his house again after work, even if paparazzi were outside. Or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she would try to visualize some sort of peaceful image whenever Nathan's face jumped into her head. Yeah, that could work. Closing her eyes, she pictured a sunny meadow overflowing with wildflowers. Then she imagined walking through it, her hands outstretched as she ran her fingers along the soft blossoms, the heat of the sun warming her upturned face as the fragrant flowers filled her nose. Ah, yes, that was better. Then a familiar voice filled her mind. Why was Nathan in her meadow? She focused on his words. Yes, a meatball sub with potato salad on the side. Chloe's eyes shot open, then zoomed to the deli counter where she saw Nathan Hewitt ordering lunch. His back was to her, but there was no mistaking his identity. The perfectly tailored suit clung to him in all the right places, and then he turned sideways and she took in his profile. Strong jaw with a closely trimmed beard, short brown hair, full lips that she remembered fantasizing about kissing. She shook her head. She couldn't think about him in those terms, not when she thought about Lisa, her baby sister, and about how she would never see her again. Regardless, Chloe couldn't tear her gaze away from Nathan, and when he finished ordering, he turned and scanned the room. Their eyes met. Chapter 4. Nathan sucked in a breath as his eyes widened. There sat the last person he'd expected to see on the first day that he'd ventured out of the sanctuary of his parents' home. Chloe James, who looked so much like her sister. The guilt that Nathan had been carrying for the last year crashed over him like a block of ice. "Sir," the man behind the counter said to him. "Sir, your lunch." His mind racing, Nathan turned back to the counter. He needed to talk to Chloe, needed to apologize, needed to explain, needed to express his deepest regrets. But what if she spit in his face? They'd been best friends, before. But now? Now she must hate him, must blame him for her sister's death. And she was right. It was his fault Lisa had been on the cruise with him. He should have kept her safe, but he hadn't. Even so, he needed to talk to Chloe. He owed her that much. He paid for his meal, collected his tray, then gathered his nerve to face Chloe. He turned around, ready to approach her table and speak to her, but all he saw was an empty chair. His focus shot to the door just in time to see her hustling out the exit. She didn't want to talk to him. That much was crystal clear. But he needed to talk to her. He would track her down and reach out. "You are such a chicken." The words slipped out of Chloe's mouth in a whisper as she practically ran back to the design firm. Nathan had been right there, and she'd fled the moment she'd seen him. What had happened to her determination to let him have a piece of her mind, to let him know how much hurt he'd caused and how much she hated him? "I'm just not ready, okay?" she thought. Her phone rang in her purse. Startled, she nearly gasped. What if it was Nathan? Hand shaking, she dug around in her purse until she came up with her phone. When she saw Hannah's name on her screen, she exhaled an audible sigh of relief. "Hey, girl," Hannah said, as if everything was normal. "Hey." Chloe's voice was tight. Even she could hear it. "What's wrong? You sound upset." She was almost back to her office, but she didn't want her coworkers to hear her business. Stopping where she was, she saw a bus stop with an empty bench nearby. Walking briskly toward it, she glanced around to make sure she was alone, then she sat on the bench. She crossed one leg over the other, then grimaced. "Guess who I nearly ran into?" "Not Nathan?" "Uh-huh." "No." "Yes." "Where?" "At the deli. I was eating my lunch when I heard his voice, at the counter, and then—" She remembered the shock of meeting those amazing gray eyes. No, she couldn't think of him like that. As attracted to him as she'd always been, she would never forget that he'd taken her sister away from her. "And then what?" Hannah asked. "Don't leave me hanging." Picturing Hannah with her phone pressed to her ear, her long blonde hair falling forward as she concentrated on the call, Chloe smiled despite herself, until she remembered how shaken she'd been. Her smile vanished. "And then he saw me." "No! What did you do?" "Like a chicken, I bolted." A bus rumbled up to the bus stop where Chloe sat, its doors hissing open. She looked at the bus driver and shook her head. The man frowned, then he closed the door and pulled away. "Can't exactly blame you," Hannah said, "but really, you've got to face him sooner or later." "Tell me something I don't know," she thought, then said, "Yeah." "So, what are you going to do now?" Chloe hadn't thought that far ahead. "Go back to work for starters." She stood as she spoke and began walking the rest of the way to the office. "You should think about what you're going to say if you see him again." That was good advice. "What would you say, Hannah?" Hannah laughed. "You mean if I were you?" "Yeah." I guess I'd say, 'Nathan, even though you're super hot and I'm glad you're alive, I kind of hate you now.' How's that?" "Pretty good, actually," Chloe said. "That's because I know you well. Now get back to work and stop thinking about Nathan Hewitt." Easier said than done, Chloe thought. "I'll try." She paused. "Why were you calling anyway?" "To see if you wanted to have lunch with me tomorrow." "I'd love to." As a bonus, if she ran into Nathan Hewitt again, she would have reinforcements, although the odds of that happening seemed pretty slim. Not sure if she was happy or relieved to realize that, she focused on not tripping over a crack in the sidewalk. She and Hannah discussed where they would meet and at what time, then they disconnected. Chloe dropped her phone in her purse, and when she reached the office, she walked inside. 2 hours later, the phone on her desk rang. Finally recovered after her near miss with Nathan, she picked up the handset. "Hello?" "Chloe?" She froze. It was him. It was Nathan. Her mouth went dry and her mind raced. What should I do? What should I do? She could hang up on him, but what would that accomplish? He would just call back. Then she remembered her conversation with Hannah. Of course, she would never tell Nathan that she thought he was hot, but she could tell him that she wanted nothing to do with him. "Chloe?" he asked again. With a purpose in mind, she straightened. Yes, this is Chloe. A ragged sigh came across the line like this was hard for him, but Chloe shoved down any empathy she may have felt. She couldn't afford to feel sorry for him, not after what he'd done. This is Nathan Hewitt. What do you want? Her tone was harsher than she'd meant it to be. I wanted to reach out, to talk to you. Clenching her teeth, Chloe glanced around to see who might overhear her conversation, but no one was close. Even so, she lowered her voice. I don't want to talk to you. He was silent, and she pictured the hurt in his eyes. Pinched with guilt, she trailed her gaze to the picture on her desk, the one of her and Lisa. Immediate pain and grief struck her, washing away any remorse she felt at her words. I understand, he finally said. I won't bother you again. He was going to hang up. Maybe she wanted to talk to him after all, at least for a minute. Wait, she said. Crushed that Chloe wanted nothing to do with him, Nathan had been about to hang up. But when she said to wait, he thought there might be hope after all. He leaned forward in his desk chair, the view of downtown Los Angeles visible in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his top-floor office at Hewlett Consolidated. Yes? He wanted to make this easy for her, so when the one word trailed off, he said, Will you meet me for drinks? She was silent, and he pictured her face, her eyebrows drawn together in indecision. It was easy to picture her, because she looked so much like Lisa, and he hadn't been able to get Lisa's face out of his head since the yacht had gone down in the middle of the ocean. When? He wanted, no, needed, to do this right away. It was eating away at him, this need to express his regrets to Chloe, the woman who had once been his best friend. Would tonight work? She was quiet again, and he was on edge as he waited for her reply. Finally she said, Yes, tonight will work. Holding back the relief-filled exhale that wanted to burst forth, Nathan smiled. Okay. He suggested the place and time, and after she agreed, they disconnected. Leaning his head back against his desk chair, he stared at the ceiling and tried to come up with a way to make things right. Chapter 5. Chloe had never been so keyed up in her life. After carefully choosing the outfit she would wear for her meeting with Nathan, form-fitting jeans and a silky red blouse, paired with heeled black boots, she called Hannah, who she'd called earlier, to recount her conversation with Nathan. I'm so nervous for this meeting, Chloe said. I'm not sure I can go through with it, but I need to go through with it. She took a deep breath. Talk me down, Hannah. Okay, first off, you have to meet him. If you don't, you'll totally regret it. Softly exhaling, Chloe nodded. You're right. Of course I am. Chloe chuckled. Go on, oh wise one. Hannah laughed. Second, despite everything, Nathan is your friend. Or, at least, he used to be. You should be celebrating that he's alive. That hit Chloe hard. Not only because her sister was not alive, but because Hannah was right. Totally and completely. Yes, that is true. Thank you. Are you feeling better now? Yes. And she was. And now she was ready to face Nathan. At least, she hoped she was. She and Hannah ended their call, and Chloe's mind went back to the day she'd met Nathan. It had been at a summer company party for Hewlett Consolidated employees and their families. At the time, Chloe's mother had worked for HC, so Chloe and Lisa had gone to the party. It had been held at an amusement park that HC had rented out for the day, just for the employees and their families. Chloe and Lisa, young teenagers at the time, had been having a blast when Nathan had literally bumped into Chloe. She'd been carrying a large cup of root beer, and when Nathan ran into her, it spilled all down the front of her t-shirt. Despite the fact that he was the cutest boy she'd ever seen, she was extremely annoyed with him. She had no idea he was the son of her mother's employer. Holding her hands out to the side as she looked at her soda-soaked shirt, she said, Why don't you watch where you're going? I'm so sorry, he said, as a look of mortification swept over his adorable face. Then do something about it, Lisa chimed in. Nathan looked at them with wide eyes. Okay. but he seemed at a loss as to what to do. With a smirk, Lisa looked at the nearby shops and said, "Buy her a new t-shirt." Nodding briskly, Nathan said, "Okay." He took a step toward the closest shop, then he turned and said, "I'll be right back." Chloe shook her head at Lisa. "That was mean. Now you're making him spend all of his money on a dumb t-shirt." Lisa laughed. "It's the least he can do." She pointed at the front of Chloe's shirt. "You don't want to wear that the rest of the day, do you?" "No." Before long, Nathan was back, a large bag in his hands. He held it out to Chloe. "I didn't know which one to get, so I bought one of each." Flabbergasted, Chloe felt her mouth fall open. "One of each?" Nathan nodded like it wasn't a big deal. "Can I have one?" Lisa asked. Nathan smiled at her. "Sure." Chloe and Lisa went into a nearby bathroom and changed, and when they came back out, Nathan was waiting. Still astonished that he'd spent so much money on the t-shirts, she handed him the bag. "You can return the ones we didn't use." He didn't seem at all concerned, but he took the bag. "Are you here with your family?" Chloe asked. Then she felt like an idiot. Of course he was there with his family. He got a funny look on his face, but he nodded and said, "Yeah." They chatted for a while, and then Chloe and Lisa invited him to hang out with them. He agreed, and after taking the unneeded t-shirts back to the shop, the three of them spent the day together. Eventually, Nathan confessed that his last name was Hewitt and that his dad owned Hewitt Consolidated, but by then, the three of them had become fast friends and his identity didn't seem important. After that day, the three of them hung out all the time. Now, thinking back to those simpler times, Chloe felt a tsunami of emotions swirling within her. On the one hand, it seemed as if Nathan had always been in her life, but on the other, if they'd never met, her sister would still be alive. Torn like never before, Chloe looked at herself in the mirror one last time before walking out to her car. Nathan checked his watch for what felt like the 100th time before looking toward the door of the restaurant. Chloe had always been prompt, and it was 20 minutes past their agreed-upon time. Had she changed her mind? Sitting at a high table in the bar area, he faced the door. Moments later, she walked in. At first, she didn't see him, so he took the opportunity to appraise her. The room was lit well enough for him to see clearly how stunningly beautiful she was. Tall and slender, long brown hair, bow-shaped lips, and those blue, blue eyes. He couldn't see her eyes from where he sat, but he knew them well. Then those eyes landed on him. He stood. As Chloe walked toward Nathan, she couldn't help but notice how handsome he looked in his slacks and button-up shirt, dark gray with the top button undone. The beard on his jaw was perfectly trimmed, and the healthy glow on his skin captured her attention. He looked good, better than she remembered. Seeing him face to face like this, with his attention focused totally on her, made Chloe feel a bit out of sorts. Ever since she'd met him, she'd been attracted to him, had crushed on him more than a little, had always wanted him to notice her as more than a friend. But it had never happened, and then he'd vanished. But now he was back. She remembered what Hannah had said, about celebrating the fact that he was alive. "Hello," he said, his voice the low, sexy timbre she knew so well. Gathering herself, she smiled, but when he stepped toward her like he was going to give her a hug, something he'd done routinely in the past, she stepped to the side and slid into the tall chair beside the table. As good as he looked, her feelings for him were too complicated for her to let him touch her in any way. "How are you?" she asked, as a way to deflect attention from her rejection. He sat across from her, unruffled, calm and cool. "I'm good." He smiled. "You look lovely, Chloe." "Thank you." Now would be the time to tell him that she was glad to see him, and how thankful she was that he'd survived the tragic yachting accident. But when she pictured Lisa sinking into the cold waters of the Pacific, her fingers desperately outstretched, and her eyes frantic with terror as seawater filled her lungs, the words stuck in her throat. They ordered their drinks, which gave Chloe a chance to regroup. Once the server left, Chloe lifted her eyes to Nathan. "Are you working at HC?" "Yeah." He chuckled. "Have to put that college education to good use." The waitress set their drinks in front of them. Nathan took a sip of his, then he said, "So, you're an interior designer?" Chloe nodded. "Yes." "How long?" "Ever since I graduated," she thought, "which was when you vanished and killed my sister." Instead, she said, "1 year." "How do you like it?" This was a topic of conversation she could be more enthusiastic about. "I love it." He smiled. "I remember that you were always redecorating the room you shared with—" His words trailed off. An uncomfortable silence followed. "With Lisa," Chloe said, not about to let her sister be forgotten, even if Nathan didn't want to speak her name. "Yes," he said, not meeting her eyes, instead picking up his drink and downing half of it. How was he going to do this? How was he possibly going to tell her how horrible he felt about what had happened? When Chloe had said Lisa's name, her eyes had snapped with fury. It was obvious that she held him responsible for Lisa's death. He held himself responsible, so there was no argument there. Clearly, she would always hold it against him. Even so, he had to express his regrets. "Chloe," he began, but she held up her hand and shook her head. "I don't want to hear it, okay? I'm not ready." Pressing his lips together in frustration, he exhaled through his nose. "Then why did you agree to meet me?" She huffed a laugh. "I don't know." Then she stared at him. Maybe I just needed to look you in the eye and tell you—" Her chin quivered, and tears filled her eyes. Seeing how grief-stricken she was tore at him, ripping his heart to shreds and embedding the guilt deeper inside him. He wanted to wrap his arms around her and comfort her like he would have before. But since he was the cause of her distress, it didn't seem right that he should be the one to offer solace. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said, his voice soft. He wanted her to know he was ready to hear whatever vitriol she needed to pour upon him. He deserved it. The look in Nathan's eyes, like he carried the weight of the world upon his shoulders, saddened Chloe. But she could only handle her own grief, and even that was nearly too much. She opened her mouth to speak, to tear into him, but suddenly she knew it wouldn't help her, it wouldn't heal her, and she knew Lisa wouldn't want her to do it. Instead, she stood from her chair, slipped her purse over her shoulder, and said, "I've got to go, Nathan. Thanks for the drink." Then she turned and strode out of the restaurant. Nathan watched her go, devastated that she'd chosen to leave rather than tell him what was on her mind. Obviously, she couldn't stand to be around him, and that wounded him more than he would have thought possible. Chapter 6. "Was I wrong?" Chloe asked Hannah as they sat across from each other at lunch the next day. "To leave like that?" Hannah pierced a chunk of chicken in her salad and lifted the fork, but stopped before placing it in her mouth. "No, I wouldn't say you were wrong exactly. More like—" She waved the fork around and pursed her ruby-red lips. "Procrastinating." Then she popped the chicken into her mouth. "Procrastinating? Why do you say that?" "Because, my dear, don't you see? You're going to have to get your feelings off of your chest and into his ears eventually. Otherwise, you'll be stuck in this loop of blame, anger, grief forever." "Wait," Chloe said. "I thought your degree was in business, not psychology." Hannah laughed. "The workings of the mind have always fascinated me, so I took a few psych courses." Chloe shook her head as she smiled. "Uh-huh." "You know I'm right, Chloe." She did, but that didn't mean she was ready to call Nathan and set up another meeting. Anyway, she didn't have his number. She and Hannah chatted about other things, and when Chloe got back to the office, she lost herself in her work, grateful she had something to take her mind off of Nathan Hewitt. "These came for you," Sally, the receptionist, said to Chloe late that afternoon, holding an enormous and gorgeous bouquet of colorful flowers. Eyes widening in surprise, Chloe stood and took the bouquet from her, setting it on the side of her desk. "Who are they from?" Sally asked, her eyebrows raised in question before she glanced meaningfully at the card poking out of the arrangement. Chloe was fairly certain who had sent them, and though she didn't want to advertise the fact that she and Nathan had met the evening before, with Sally standing there waiting, it would be awkward to ignore the card. Chloe tugged the card out of the arrangement, confirmed that the flowers were from Nathan, then smiled at Sally. "From an old friend." "Nice friend," Sally said, her tone showing she wished she had a friend like that. Without responding, Chloe tucked the card into the pocket of her slacks, then she sat at her desk. Sally must have gotten the message that no other information would be forthcoming, because she turned and walked away. Once Sally was safely out of view, Chloe pulled the card back out of her pocket and read the message. It said, "Chloe, it was wonderful to see you last night, but I wish I'd been able to spend more time with you." Chloe smirked. He made it sound like it had been his choice to end the meetup, like he'd been called away by an important phone call or something. She continued reading. "I'd like another chance to talk. If you would be willing to meet with me, let me know. Nathan." He included his cell number. Chloe stared at the digits, trying to decide if she should put the number in her phone or shove the card through the shredder. She needed to talk to Hannah, needed to get a second opinion. So the moment Chloe got home from work that evening, she called Hannah. "You have to admit," Hannah said, "the bouquet is gorgeous." Chloe had taken a picture of the arrangement and sent it to Hannah. She'd also brought the flowers home. They were gorgeous, and she wanted to enjoy them, even if her feelings for Nathan were confused. No disagreement there. "So, are you going to text him?" Chloe had been considering that question ever since the flowers had arrived. "I haven't decided yet." Hannah laughed. "That's better than a flat-out no." Smiling, Chloe let her eyes drift to the flowers, which sat in the center of her dining room table. Then she pictured Nathan, the epitome of tall, dark, and handsome. She wanted to see him. Maybe she even needed to. "True," she replied. "So, are you going to see him?" Grimacing a little, Chloe said, "I think I need to." "And you're not going to bolt once you get there, right?" Holding back a chuckle, Chloe said, "I'll try not to." "Good." Chloe tucked her legs underneath her on the couch and moved the phone to her other ear. "Maybe I don't know, needed to see him face to face first, so that I could prepare myself for the real meeting." Hannah burst out laughing. "The real meeting? What does that even mean?" Rolling her eyes, Chloe said, "Seeing him after all this time, and after thinking he was dead." Not to mention the way he'd seemed to sweep Lisa's name under the rug, she thought. "I just wasn't prepared." "Are you prepared now?" "I'll make sure I am, before I see him." How she would do this preparing, she had no idea, but she had to be in the right state of mind when she saw him. How else would she be able to express all the emotion she'd had over the last year? "All I can say," Hannah said, "is be honest with him." Right, she thought, but that would be the hardest part of all. It had been 24 hours since Nathan had sent the flowers to Chloe. Had she gotten them? The florist had told him that they had delivered them to the front desk at the design firm where she worked. But had someone given them to her? There was no way to know, not until she acknowledged them. A simple thank you was all it would take, although what he really wanted was for her to accept his invitation for another meeting. Maybe she was considering it. He had to give her time, especially after the way she'd reacted to him when they'd met for drinks, running out on him after only a few minutes. He just hoped she wasn't ready to cut him out of her life altogether. He couldn't imagine not having her in his life. He turned his focus back to the spreadsheet on his computer screen. He'd been at headquarters for 3 days now, but so far so good. He knew his dad was getting him started slowly, and he appreciated that, but he was also glad to have something to keep his mind occupied. His phone chimed a text. Glancing at the screen, when he saw the words, "Thank you for the flowers," he swept the phone into his hand and swiped to unlock the screen. After tossing and turning all night, and then not being able to focus fully on her job, Chloe had given up and decided to get this whole thing with Nathan over with. So she texted him. She reread the message she'd just sent. From Chloe. "Thank you for the flowers. They're beautiful. I'm sorry I ran out on you last night. If it's so important to you that we meet, I'm willing to give it a try." She set her phone aside and turned back to her computer, but when her phone chimed a text moments later, her eyes shifted to her phone. The text was from Nathan. Not sure whether to be pleased or dismayed, she picked up her phone and read his reply. From Nathan. I would very much like to meet with you. Are you available this evening? Slight panic burst inside her. She was willing to see him, but not yet. Tonight won't work, she texted back, hating that she was already chickening out. From Nathan, tomorrow? From Chloe, busy. Chloe could hear Hannah scolding her for putting him off, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. He replied a few moments later. From Nathan, I'm hosting a party at my parents' house Friday night. Kind of a welcome home thing. I'd love for you to stop by. Nibbling on her bottom lip, Chloe considered it, then texted, Could I bring a friend? He replied, Of course. Okay, she thought, that could work, if Hannah would come with her. From Chloe, I'll try to make it. From Nathan, Great, see you then. Next, she filled Hannah in, and only after Hannah had agreed to go was she able to relax and focus on her job. Chapter 7. Let's do this, Chloe said, with a tone of trepidation, as she and Hannah walked through the Hewitts' front door Friday night. Rock music filled the air, and people were everywhere. Servers circulated among the crowd, some carrying food-laden trays, others carrying trays with a variety of drinks. People were laughing and chatting, and some were dancing, but everyone looked like they were having a fabulous time. Chloe let her gaze sweep the room. Nathan was not in sight. Relieved, yet also anxious, Chloe turned to Hannah, who was taking in the whole scene. Now what? Hannah tilted her head. Now you circulate and have a good time, and let Nathan find you. Although Chloe couldn't disagree with the idea that Nathan needed to seek her out, waiting to have this conversation put her on edge. Right. Good, Hannah said. Then she hooked her arm through Chloe's. Let's go. With that, they made their way into the crowd, chatting with those they knew. All the while, Chloe was on high alert for Nathan's approach. It felt good to Nathan to see his old friends, felt good to know how much people cared and were happy he was back. No one seemed to blame him for Lisa's death. At least, no one had said to his face that it was his fault. Nathan looked over the room full of people. As thrilled as he was to have everyone there celebrating his return, there was only one person he wanted to see. And there she was. Chloe's back was to him, but there was no mistaking that long, wavy brown hair, that tilt of her head, the confident way she held herself. He needed to talk to her. Though intellectually he knew Lisa's death wasn't his fault, because he'd done nothing to make the yacht sink, in his heart he couldn't shake the blame. If he could gain Chloe's forgiveness, he knew he could move on with his life. Not only that, but Chloe had been so integral to his life for so many years that he couldn't imagine his life with her not in it. With a deep breath, he moved in her direction. A light touch on Chloe's arm got her attention, and when she turned and saw Nathan standing beside her, his gray eyes intense, she felt her heart stutter before it went into a frantic beat. This was it. This was what she had been dreading and anticipating for days. Hi, she said lamely. He smiled, his full lips framing his perfectly straight white teeth. Glad you made it. He gestured with his head toward the outdoor space. Can we talk? Chloe's heart pounded harder. Yeah. Then, with a glance at Hannah, who gave her a subtle nod, she turned and followed Nathan outside. The spring evening was pleasant, and the sun was still shining, and as they walked across the spacious property to a quiet area, Chloe took in the view of beautiful green hills. It was tranquil here, which, unfortunately, did nothing to calm her galloping heart. Let's sit, Nathan said, sweeping his hand toward a grouping of comfortable-looking chairs. A table adorned with fresh flowers completed the arrangement. Chloe did as he asked, and as he settled into the chair adjacent to hers, she drew in a lungful of air and tried to center herself before slowly exhaling through her nose. I appreciate you coming. Chloe noticed how the burgundy of his button-up shirt emphasized his tan. A tan, she reminded herself, that he got while stranded on a deserted island, which was what this party was all about, a celebration that he had returned home. Trying to focus on the positive, she pushed a smile onto her lips. I never told you, Nathan, but I am glad you're alive. A flush crept up his cheeks, and his lips compressed as he looked away. When he turned back to her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm so sorry about Lisa. Hearing her name coming from his mouth was like hearing the news of her death all over again, and without warning, tears sprang into Chloe's eyes. She wanted to say, thank you, wanted him to know that she appreciated the sentiment, but the words had jammed up in her throat. Instead, she spoke in a soft voice. I miss her. Every single day. He nodded, his lips compressed. I think about her every day, too. That wasn't the same. He wasn't Lisa's sister. He hadn't spent every day of his life with her. Even so, she could see the sincerity in his eyes. A small smile lifted her lips. I appreciate that. Nathan shifted in his seat, looking away before meeting Chloe's eyes. I feel responsible. Shocked to hear him say what she believed, Chloe spoke without thinking. You are responsible, Nathan. Hearing Chloe say those words pierced Nathan to the depths of his soul. He hadn't expected her to fawn all over him and say he didn't have anything to do with Lisa's death, but he certainly hadn't expected her to flat out blame him. Regardless, he accepted her accusation without argument. It was no more than he deserved. Then, after several moments of silence, he said, I hope one day you can forgive me. With her eyes locked on his, Chloe pursed her lips before saying, I can't promise that. I'm not asking you to. She nodded, then her eyes shifted to where the party was happening before going back to his face. I'm gonna go. She stood, and he leapt to his feet. We've been friends for years, Chloe. I hope that hasn't changed. Let's be honest, a lot has changed. Did that mean she wanted nothing to do with him? He hoped not, because up until the moment he and Lisa had sailed away, Chloe had been a major part of his life. He didn't want that to end. He offered her his hand as a friendly gesture, and to his delight, she placed her fingertips in his grasp briefly before taking her hand away. Her lips turned up slightly. Take care, Nathan. Then she turned and strode away. He watched her go, determined to earn back her friendship, needing her friendship. Even more, needing her forgiveness. Only then would he be able to forgive himself. Whoa, Chloe said as she and Hannah drove away from the Hewitt mansion. Chloe was behind the wheel. Hannah laughed. That tells me exactly nothing about how your little meeting went. Chloe glanced at Hannah before facing the road again. It went better than I thought it would, I guess. You didn't bolt, Hannah said, so that's progress. Chloe chuckled. Actually, I kind of did, but only after telling him how I felt. She looked at Hannah, all humor gone. I told him Lisa's death was his fault. She grimaced as she said it, because when she pictured the look on Nathan's face, self-blame and deep regret, she felt bad. Woe is right, Hannah said, but I'm glad you had a chance to tell him what was on your mind. Me too. How did you leave it? He wants me to forgive him, and he wants to be friends again. And what did you say? I said I couldn't make any promises. Hannah nodded. That's reasonable. Was it, she wondered, because she wasn't sure. She'd always been taught that she should forgive everyone, but this was a tough one. And as far as being friends, how could she be friends with a man who had taken so much from her? Then again, she'd always loved his company, not to mention the attraction she'd always felt toward him, still felt toward him, if she was honest with herself. Time was what it would take. Time and a renewal of trust. But was that renewal even possible? Chapter 8. Over the next few weeks, Nathan reached out to Chloe several times, but she couldn't bring herself to accept any of his invitations to get together. Having a good time with him felt wrong when her sister could no longer do those things. Instead, each time she politely refused. Now, as she looked at the lovely bouquet of flowers on her kitchen table, the second bouquet he'd sent since returning from his ill-fated cruise, she frowned. Either you need to go out with him, Hannah said as she sat on Chloe's couch, or you need to tell him to leave you alone." Chloe tucked her legs under her as she sat on the other end of the couch. "Yeah, I guess you're right." "So what's it going to be?" She thought it over. On the one hand, she didn't want to end their friendship, but on the other, she wasn't ready to go back to the relationship they had before tragedy had struck. Suddenly, she knew what she had to do. She picked up her phone and typed a message. "What are you doing?" Hannah asked. Feeling a sense of determination, Chloe hit send, then she smiled at Hannah. "I just sent Nathan a text." "What did you tell him?" Chloe looked at her phone. "I said, I'm not ready to pick up where we left off." She looked at Hannah to get her reaction. "What do you think?" Smirking, Hannah said, "I think you don't know what you want." Chloe laughed. "You know me too well." Then she wondered what Nathan would make of the message. A week later, Chloe's boss, Samantha, who was also the owner of the design firm, asked Chloe to stop by her office. They often met to discuss current projects, so when Chloe sat in the chair on the other side of the desk from Samantha, she was calm and relaxed. "We have a new client," Samantha started, "an extremely important client." Chloe's curiosity was piqued. "Who is it?" Samantha held up her hand. "I'll get to that in a minute." Then she clasped her hands together and rested them on top of her desk. "If things go well with this client, it could lead to many more opportunities for this firm." "That's great," Chloe said, baffled why Samantha was telling her this. She never discussed these kinds of things with her. "This client is ready to choose our firm," Samantha said, "but there's a catch." Chloe's curiosity intensified. She tilted her head in question. "This client will only choose our firm if you're the designer, Chloe." Recoiling slightly, Chloe felt her mouth fall open. She'd only been out of design school for 1 year. In fact, she was the most junior designer on staff. Why in the world would someone want her, insist on her? It made no sense. "Who is it?" Her voice was laced with caution. Samantha moved her hands from the desk to her lap, her lips pursing. "Nathan Hewitt." Now Chloe really recoiled. "What?" Her mind flew in 100 directions at once. Why was Nathan doing this? What did he need decorated? Why was he insisting on her? Did he really think this was the best way to mend their friendship? What if she said no? Would she lose her job? What if she said yes? What would happen then? Samantha had straightened in her chair. She said, "I know there's history, shall we say, between you and Nathan Hewitt." That was an understatement, but that wasn't what was forefront in Chloe's mind. There were bigger things than that filling her head, like whether her job was about to end or about to get very interesting, and maybe not in a good way. One of Samantha's eyebrows had arched in question. Chloe didn't want to discuss her relationship with Nathan, but it looked like she couldn't avoid it. "It's complicated," she finally said, using the phrase that explained exactly nothing while saying so much. "Okay," Samantha said with a tight smile. "Is it too complicated to accept this job? A job, I might add, that would make your portfolio shine." There was that, she thought, because one day, when she felt like she had enough experience under her belt, Chloe wanted to open her own design firm. Designing for Nathan Hewitt, billionaire, could be the jumping-off point she needed. That is, if she could handle being around him. Chloe looked at the eagerness on Samantha's face. Samantha had been a great mentor, kind and helpful, willing to step in whenever Chloe had a design question, and she'd taken a chance on her right after she'd graduated. Turning down this opportunity would be a terrible way to repay all that Samantha had done for her. "I'll do it," she said, but she had to push the smile onto her lips. Relief swept over Samantha's face. "Thank you, Chloe. You'll do a fabulous job, and if you need any help, you can come to me at any time." "Thank you." "I'll email you the contact info Nathan gave me." An embarrassed smile washed over Samantha's face. "You may already have it. I don't know." Feeling bad that Samantha had been put in this awkward position, Chloe tried to hide her annoyance with Nathan. He was an important client after all, and that's all he would be to her. "Thanks, Samantha. I'll reach out to him and set things in motion." I knew I could count on you, Chloe. Nathan must have known that too, she thought. With a tight smile, Chloe left Samantha's office and went back to her desk, all the while repeating in her mind, "He's just a client, just a client, just a client." Chapter 9. This wasn't the way Nathan had wanted to earn back his friendship with Chloe, but she'd left him no choice. Anyway, he really did need a designer to help him rehab the house he'd just bought, and if she couldn't stand to be around him, she could always walk, although he couldn't picture her doing that. Now, as he waited for her to arrive for a consultation at his newly purchased house in the hills above Los Angeles, he realized he was nervous, really nervous. Would she go through with this? Or would she give him that look that said he was a terrible person and then walk away? 20 minutes later, he saw her car pull into the long driveway. Chloe braced herself to see Nathan. Mentally putting on her designer hat, she tried to smother any negative feelings she had toward him. To help her get in the right frame of mind, she stayed in her car and let her gaze sweep over the house. It was nowhere near as large as his parents' mansion, but the size was still impressive. Had he just bought it? He'd been staying at his parents' house, but it made sense that he would want his own space. He was 24 after all, and, Chloe was certain, he could afford to buy whatever house he wanted. What kinds of changes would he want? A complete redo, or just a few minor changes? A mix of excitement and trepidation flooded her. Blowing out a breath, she opened her car door, swung her feet to the pavement, and strode up the walkway to the front door. With a confident-sounding knock, more confident than she actually felt, she made her presence known. The front door opened, and there he stood. It had been nearly 6 weeks since she'd seen him, and although she'd thought about him constantly during that time, how could she not when he kept reaching out to her and sending her flowers? She'd been so focused on her hard feelings toward him that she'd forgotten how much she'd always been attracted to him. But now, with him standing in front of her, his gray eyes sparkling in his handsome face, Chloe had to take a moment to gather herself. Her professional hat was slipping, and her college girl attracted to her best friend hat was trying to take its place. "Good morning," she said brightly, forcibly crushing that unwelcome hat under her mental foot while shoving a purely professional smile onto her lips. "Good morning," he said, his smile warm and friendly, so unhelpful in her struggle. Tearing her eyes from his, she looked at the space surrounding them, letting her gaze stop on the sad-looking front yard, which put her back partially toward him. "When did you buy this place?" "Just closed on it a few days ago." Then he chuckled. "It's kind of a fixer." Knowing she was being rude by having her back to him, something she would never do to a client, she turned around and met his eyes. "What made you decide to get a fixer?" Nathan would never admit it, but he'd bought this place for the express purpose of having Chloe be his designer. If she had refused, he would have sold it and bought something else. Maybe it was underhanded, but how else was he supposed to get her to spend time with him? She'd rebuffed him every time he'd reached out, and it wasn't like she had to accept this job. So maybe, deep down, she wanted to give him a chance to earn back her friendship. At least, he hoped so, because seeing her standing there looking so professional, nothing like the girl he'd grown up with, made him want to get to know her all over again, and maybe as more than a friend. She was different than she'd been when he'd sailed away. He was too, and he wanted a fresh start. She'd always been important in his life, and he wasn't willing to let her go, not without a fight. "Guess I wanted a house that perfectly fits my needs," he said in reply to her question, "and the best way to do that, short of building from scratch, was to fix up an existing house." "The question is, what kind of house will perfectly fit your needs?" He opened the door wider and with a soft chuckle said, "Since I can't live in a cave anymore." She looked startled by his statement, and it struck him that he hadn't told her anything about his time on the island. After all they'd shared growing up, it seemed kind of crazy that she didn't know a thing about what his life had been like for the last year. Wanting to smooth out the awkward moment, he quickly added, "Anyway, I need help figuring out what I want." She stepped over the threshold, then turned to him. "Why don't we start with a tour?" He was happy to do whatever she wanted. As long as she didn't make the place look like a dollhouse, he would be content. They walked through the spacious living room, through a large adjoining dining room, and into the kitchen. "How big is this place?" Chloe asked as they passed into another spacious room. "Just over 8,000 square feet," which was ridiculous as far as he was concerned. After living in a cave for a year, his needs were simple. He would have been perfectly happy living in a one-bedroom condo, but, he was sure, that would take Chloe very little time to design, whereas this place would take her months to do. As Chloe followed Nathan from room to room, her excitement at taking on this project grew. She could visualize moving walls to give the place a more open concept, replacing existing windows with floor-to-ceiling sliders that would bring the outdoors in, as well as adding high-end finishes to the kitchen and multiple bathrooms. The possibilities were endless. "What's your budget?" she asked, suddenly realizing that he might not want to spend a crazy amount of money. They'd completed the tour, ending back on the main floor, and were standing beside a window that had a sweeping view of the nearby mountains. "However much you need," he said, without blinking an eye. A sly grin curved her lips. "Are you sure about that? I have a lot of ideas." He laughed. "Yeah, I'm sure." More excited than ever to take on this project, for a moment she forgot that she'd been reluctant to agree to this, but that reluctance had only been because she wasn't sure about being around Nathan. Somehow, though, her excitement completely overrode the bad feeling she'd been harboring. Or maybe it was because she was beginning to accept that Nathan was home, even if Lisa was gone. Not wanting to think about that right then, because it only brought back the dark cloud that she'd been working to rid herself of, she turned to Nathan. "If you don't mind, I'd like to spend some time here on my own to take pictures of the space and sketch out ideas." A look of relief swept over his face, as if he'd been worried that she might turn down this project, which reminded her of the precariousness of their relationship. "No problem," he said with a smile. He handed her a key. "Spend as much time as you need." She took the key from his hand. "Thanks." "No, thank you, Chloe. I wasn't sure you'd be willing to work with me on this." "Why did you want me to do it?" she asked, as she dropped the key into the purse slung over her shoulder. "I know you've been gone a while," she began, as she tried to hold down the hostility that wanted to push to the surface. "But you must know I have limited experience. So why did you choose, insist on me?" He stared at her. "I thought this arrangement could be mutually beneficial." Tilting her head in question, Chloe waited for him to elaborate, but when he simply said, "I'll leave you to it," before striding to the front door and leaving, Chloe was left wondering what his motives truly were. Chapter 10. First thing the next morning, Chloe returned to Nathan's house. Wanting to avoid him, she hadn't told him she was coming. Eventually, though, she would have to spend great amounts of time with him, approving plans, picking out colors and finishes, inspecting the progress. Unless he was going to give her carte blanche on the project and not show up until it was done, but she highly doubted that was in his plans. The day before, she'd taken pictures of all the rooms and sketched some ideas. Now, though, after taking time to digest what she'd seen, she was ready to do a deeper dive into each room and begin more solid design plans. 2 hours later, standing at the kitchen counter, immersed in her work, when she heard the front door close, she was startled. Had she left it unlocked? "Hello?" she called out, as she took her cell phone out of her pocket, ready to call 911. "Hello," Nathan said with a smile as he walked into the kitchen. He had 2 large cups in his hands, with a logo of Chloe's favorite smoothie place imprinted on the sides. "Shouldn't you be at work?" she asked, then immediately wanted to edit herself. It wasn't her place to question a client about his schedule. "Probably," Nathan said, as he set the cups on the counter, "but I wanted to see how things are going here." "How did you know I would be here?" He chuckled. "I didn't, but you've always been a go-getter, so I figured you would be. And," he added, as he pointed to the cups on the counter, "I got your favorite smoothie flavor, chocolate strawberry." He squinted at her. "It is still your favorite, isn't it?" It was, but she wanted to deny it. How was she supposed to hold on to her bad feelings toward him when he kept being so thoughtful? First the flowers, then hiring her for a major project, and now thinking of her and bringing her just the right treat. Yeah, she said with some reluctance, although she added a smile to show she was grateful, even if her heart wasn't completely in it. He's a client, she thought. Treat him that way. Thank you. You're welcome. His focus turned to the laptop open on the counter. How's it going? Have you designed the whole house already? Smirking, Chloe said, Not quite, but I am making progress. What do you have so far? Thinking about all of her ideas made it easy to put a bright smile on her face. She turned and gestured toward one of the walls in the kitchen. I propose that we take out that wall and open the space up, really give it an open concept. Nathan could see the excitement in Chloe's face as she explained what she wanted to do. It made him feel good to see her happy, and to know he had something to do with it warmed him. She turned toward the window over the sink. We can put in a huge picture window here to really take advantage of the view. Trying to act like he had a clue, he asked, Won't I lose a lot of storage? He narrowed his eyes as if he was concerned about where he would put his non-existent dishes. You'll actually have more storage, Chloe said, clearly on top of things. We'll push this other wall out and add cabinets there. He was starting to catch her vision and found himself becoming genuinely excited. I like it. I want to reconfigure several of the bathrooms as well, so if you have time, we can go over that now. He was in no hurry to leave, not as long as she was there. They walked together to the master bedroom on the second floor, and after she explained all the changes she wanted to make, he made a couple of suggestions. She nodded in agreement, and then they went to one of the 5 guest bathrooms where she had ideas about how to better use the space. As Nathan listened to Chloe explain her vision, her arms swooping around in grand gestures to explain where things would go and how things would change, Nathan found himself becoming captivated by her. Growing up, and even as college students, he'd always found her to be loads of fun and a really good friend, but that's all she had been, a friend. Now, though, ever since that first brief meeting over drinks, he'd found it hard to get her out of his mind. What do you think? He'd been so caught up in watching her speak that he'd hardly heard a word she'd said. Yeah, that'll be perfect. Her eyebrows rose. Really? No suggestions? He hoped he actually liked what she'd proposed. Then again, it was a guest bathroom, so he really didn't care. Yeah, I think it'll be great. She stared at him for several seconds, and he wondered what she was thinking. I've taken up enough of your time, she finally said. Then with a small lift to her lips, she added, I'd better go incorporate the changes we discussed in the master bathroom. Then she turned and walked out of the guest bathroom. Nathan watched her go, wanting nothing more than to continue his time with her. He joined her in the kitchen where she was typing on her laptop. I'd like to take you to dinner, Chloe, he heard himself say, which was something that wouldn't have been a big deal to suggest before. She looked at him sharply, her fingers still poised over the keyboard. I don't think that's a good idea. Why's that? They'd gone to dinner so many times that he'd lost count, but he knew things were different now, tense and unresolved. She straightened. You're my client, Nathan. I don't... She looked away from him and at her computer screen. I don't date my clients. In all the times they'd gone to dinner, it had never been as a date. It had always been as friends, so why was she suggesting that's what it would be? Then he knew. It had been in his tone and in the way he'd asked. Before, he would have tossed it off as a casual suggestion like, let's grab some food. He should have done that now. But with the way things were between them, it would have been disingenuous. Besides, he wanted it to be a date. It wasn't too late to turn things around. This wouldn't be a date. It would be a business dinner. Chloe's eyes narrowed as if she thought he'd just made that up, which he totally had, but he powered through it anyway. I need to discuss some things about the house with you. She cupped her hip with her hand. Like what? He hadn't thought that far ahead, but he should have known she wouldn't easily fall for his ploy. She knew him too well. Like, the budget. Yesterday you said I could spend whatever was necessary to get the job done. Her head tilted. Has that changed? Pretending like this had been on his mind all along, he said, "I'll need a detailed breakdown of expenses." She folded her arms across her chest and gave him a look that asked if he was really that dense. "I'll be happy to, Nathan, but that information is nowhere near ready. I only started yesterday." "Right." Her lips pursed, and he knew his game was up. "Let's be clear, Nathan. I'm your designer and nothing more. I have no interest in going out with you or spending time with you outside of this project, okay?" Disappointment, sharp and unexpected, pierced him. As much as he wanted to earn back her friendship, as it turned out, he wanted much more than that. Once Nathan left, Chloe was finally able to relax. When she'd given him her "I'll never go out with you" speech, she could tell he'd been hurt. Regardless, she knew it was the right decision. And even though deep down she maybe did want to rekindle her friendship with him, and even though her attraction to him hadn't waned at all, she knew she had to keep her distance. Things could never go back to how they had been, not with Lisa gone, and it didn't seem right to try. Softly sighing, Chloe packed up her laptop and sketches and scribbled notes and headed to the office where she could stop thinking about Nathan Hewitt and instead focus on fabrics and tiles and designs. Chapter 11. It was time to get Nathan to sign off on the plans that she, with some help from Samantha, had developed. It had been over a week since she'd seen Nathan, and now, as she waited for him to answer his phone, she felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation. "Hello?" "Hi, Nathan. It's Chloe." "Oh, hey. How are you?" She could hear the smile in his voice, and without conscious thought she smiled as well. "I'm good. I need to get together with you and go over the designs I worked up." "Okay." "Can you meet at the house today?" "I'm actually pretty slammed today. The only available time I have is tomorrow during lunch." Was he playing her? Was he trying to get her to go out with him without calling it a date? With a suppressed sigh, she realized it didn't matter. He was the client and she was the designer. She had to meet with him when he was available, whether or not the time he suggested was truly the only time he could meet. Even so, she could keep it on a professional level. "All right," she replied. "I can meet with you at your office tomorrow during lunch. Does that work?" He hesitated, like that hadn't been exactly what he'd had in mind, like maybe he'd been hoping to take her to a restaurant. Checkmate, Chloe thought. "Yeah," he finally said, "that works. I'll have lunch brought in and we can go over your plans." "Perfect." She hoped she didn't sound too triumphant to have bested him, but deep down, okay, maybe not deep at all, she was pleased that she'd outsmarted him. Nathan wanted everything to be perfect. The day before, when Chloe had called to set up this meeting, he'd been sure he'd found a way to take her out, but she'd figured out a workaround before he'd set anything in stone. Smiling at her cleverness, because it reminded him of the times he'd competed with her and Lisa to see who could come up with the best ideas, he glanced at the clock, saw that she would be there in only a few minutes, then took a moment to straighten the stack of papers on his desk before glancing around his spacious office and making sure everything looked presentable. "Your lunch appointment is here," Evelyn, his assistant, said, poking her head into the room. Nathan's heartbeat sped up, but he gave Evelyn a curt nod before standing. Moments later, Chloe walked in, a laptop bag over one shoulder. "Hello," she said, her smile warm but professional. Nathan appraised her. She wore dark gray slacks that emphasized her slim figure, and a sapphire blue blouse that set off her eyes. Her thick brown hair fell halfway down her back, and her full lips shimmered with some sort of gloss. She was stunning. Though he'd known her for years, there was something about her now that grabbed his attention and wouldn't let go. Whether it was the aloof air she put off, or the self-confidence she exuded, or something else entirely, he had no idea. All he knew was that he desperately wanted something deeper than friendship with her, but that would be difficult if he couldn't even achieve friendship. "Good to see you," he said as he walked toward her, forcing himself to downplay the way he actually felt as he put on his professional mask. "Thank you for coming here to meet with me." Chloe held back a smirk, because she knew they were both aware that meeting at his office wasn't exactly what he'd wanted. "Thank you for making time to see me." She had to admit, at least silently, that he looked really hot in his perfectly tailored suit with his trimmed beard and gray eyes. But what did that matter? He was her client, nothing more. Dragging her gaze away from him, she looked around the spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows and fabulous views of downtown Los Angeles. "Where would you like me to set up?" "Over here." He walked to a round table that had 2 chairs positioned around it. Chloe strode to the table and took out her laptop before setting it on the tabletop. Then she sat in one of the chairs while Nathan sat in the other. She opened her laptop, pulled up the software that displayed how each room would look, then she turned the laptop so Nathan could see the screen. But with the way they were sitting, she wasn't able to see it well enough to do her presentation. With some reluctance, she moved her chair closer to his and swiveled the laptop so that they could both see the screen. Less than 2 feet separated them. Nathan's musky cologne drifted into her nose, and she had to work to focus her attention on the screen. "So," she began, forcing her mind onto the project, "as you can see, this is the exterior of the house." "Looks like you've changed the elevation to a more modern look." "Yes, what do you think?" She shifted her body slightly so that she could more comfortably look at Nathan, and when their eyes met, she felt energy arc between them. "It looks great," he said, his voice low and sexy. "You're very talented, Chloe." Trying to control the blush that raced up her cheeks, she looked away as if she was concerned about which key to press to move to the next screen. "Thank you." With Chloe sitting so close, Nathan had to crush the urge to rest his arm along the back of her chair, because if he gave in to it, he was certain she would leap up and scold him. She'd made it crystal clear that she wanted nothing to do with him outside of this project, and he had to respect that, but he found it increasingly difficult to think of her as only his designer. As Chloe began going through the images of all the rooms in his house and what she wanted to do, he had to work to focus on what she was telling him. It wasn't that it didn't interest him, because it did. It was more that his gaze kept slipping to her mouth as he imagined how it would feel to press his lips to hers. They looked so soft and full. "Nathan!" Her tone was sharp, and he realized he'd been staring at her mouth as she spoke. His eyes snapped to hers, and he saw something there that surprised him. Not anger or annoyance, but something else. Something that said maybe his hope wasn't in vain. Chapter 12. Why was Nathan staring at her mouth like he wanted to? Chloe didn't want to think about what he may or may not want to do. She couldn't think about things like that, not if she wanted to keep distance between them, and she most definitely did. He's a client, she reminded herself, just a client. The door to the office swung open, and Nathan's assistant stepped inside. "Lunch is ready, sir." Confused, Chloe looked at Nathan for an explanation. They weren't going out, and no food had been brought in. He smiled and got to his feet. "If you'll follow me." What was he up to? Determined to keep this strictly a business meeting, she put her laptop in her laptop bag before standing. Then, with a meaningful glance at Nathan, who gave her a half smirk, she walked with him out of his office with her bag slung over her shoulder. Moments later, they entered a small conference room. But it didn't look like a conference would be happening anytime soon. Instead, it looked like a fancy restaurant had been dropped inside. Several potted trees were placed around the space with sparkling lights woven through the branches. A round conference table that looked like it normally fit 4 people had a lovely cream-colored tablecloth spread over it, and only 2 chairs surrounded it. In the center of the table was a gorgeous bouquet of colorful flowers, and on either side were beautiful table settings, white plates with gold etching, white cloth napkins, silver utensils, and crystal goblets. To one side stood a man in a server's uniform. Kind of astonished at the elegance of the room, Chloe didn't know what to say. "Please sit down," Nathan said as he swept an arm toward the table. Not knowing what else to do, Chloe set her laptop bag on the floor and made her way to the table where Nathan held the chair for her. "Thank you," she said as Nathan helped her sit. He sat across from her, then he gave the server a brief nod. The server went to a nearby table where 2 plates with silver covers rested. He carried them to their table, setting one in front of Chloe and one in front of Nathan. The man lifted the silver lids, and the delicious scent of grilled salmon with rice and asparagus filled the air. Then the man left the room, and it was just the two of them. Impressed, Chloe said, "Very nice." Nathan smiled. "I remember that you like salmon." Chloe wondered what else he remembered about her. She was fairly certain he had no idea that she'd crushed on him over the years. Speaking of, why didn't she take advantage of his interest in her now? But she knew why. Before she could go there, she had to truly forgive him for what had happened to Lisa. And she didn't know if she could ever do that. Not wanting to think about that, she picked up her fork and began eating. The food was heavenly, melting in her mouth. "How's your mom doing?" Nathan asked, before spearing a bit of asparagus and placing it in his mouth. Chloe thought about her mother and how devastated she'd been when she'd learned that her baby girl had died. Chloe's parents had divorced when Chloe was young, and her father lived back east with his new family, so he hadn't been the best support system through the years, and at the news of Lisa's death hadn't done anything to help comfort her or her mother. Chloe and her mom only had each other. Even so, her mom was doing much better. It had been nearly a year since Lisa's body had been found, and her mom had managed to go on, just as Chloe had. "She has good days and bad days," Chloe said, then thought, "just like me." Then she added, "But she's getting by." Again she thought, "just like me." Chloe could see grief and regret etched in Nathan's eyes. Clearly, he was hurting too, but she wasn't in a place where she could help him. She was still trying to help herself. Nathan rested his forearms on the table and regarded Chloe. "I know I can never make up for Lisa's absence, but I want you to know how much I wish I could change what happened." Discussing this with him made Chloe's stomach churn and her heart ache. She just couldn't do it. Then she remembered that this was supposed to be a business meeting. They were getting way off track and way too personal. He's a client, she thought, just a client. Chloe nodded to acknowledge his words. Then she stood and retrieved her laptop bag, bringing it back to the table and taking it out before opening it and setting it on the table where they could both see it. "I have a few more design plans to discuss with you." Nathan stared at her like he was hoping for something different, something more. Then, with a frown, he nodded. Chloe took him through the rest of her plans as they ate, and once she'd noted all of the changes he wanted, she set her napkin on the table and turned to him with a smile. "Again, thank you for making the time to meet with me, and thank you for the lovely meal. I'm eager to take the next step in this project." She tucked her laptop in her bag and pushed her chair back before standing. Nathan leapt to his feet. "Is there anything else you'd like to discuss?" "Like what?" she wanted to ask, but instead she shook her head and gave him one last smile before turning toward the door. Nathan wasn't ready for Chloe to leave. He'd enjoyed her company so much, even if they'd primarily talked about his house. He was beyond glad that he'd cooked up the idea of buying a fixer and had managed to bring her onto the project. Otherwise, instead of spending the little time with her that he had, he'd be stewing in his regrets. At least now it felt like they were moving forward, even if it was just baby steps. "When will you be at the house next?" "I'll be meeting with a contractor there tomorrow morning, but I have everything well in hand, so you don't need to be there." What she obviously meant was that she didn't want him to be there, but it was his house, and he could do what he liked, although he dreaded the thought of seeing disappointment on her face if he showed up. Regardless, he would make the time to stop by. "All right," he said, not committing one way or the other to his plans. "I appreciate all you're doing, Chloe, and I'm excited to see the changes come to life." With a professional smile, she held out her hand. "I'll let you know how tomorrow's meeting goes." He stared at her hand. This was so unlike the easy friendship they used to have. Giving in to their new reality, he took her hand in his, relishing the feel of the softness of her skin, then boldly stared into her eyes as he smiled. He wanted to get the message across that he had feelings for her, feelings that went beyond friendship. Chloe blinked several times, seemingly flustered. Then she withdrew her hand from his before opening the door to the conference room and stepping into the hall. Watching her retreating back, he held back a smile. She had feelings for him too. He knew it, and they weren't all negative. Chapter 13. When Nathan pulled up to his house the next morning, he saw Chloe's car parked in the driveway, along with a truck that must belong to the contractor. Wondering how she would react to his presence, he marched up the driveway and walked inside the house, quietly closing the front door behind him. He heard voices coming from the kitchen, but couldn't yet see Chloe or the contractor, so he stopped to listen. They were discussing moving a wall, and as Nathan listened, he was impressed with the commanding tone Chloe used. She was obviously confident in what she was doing. He thought back to the years he'd known her. Though she'd always been hesitant to do things like fly down a snow-covered hill on skis or race across the water on a jet ski, she'd never held back from speaking her mind. He grinned as he remembered her furious reaction when he'd bumped into her at the amusement park when they were just teenagers, making her spill her drink all over her shirt. What if that hadn't happened? What if he'd never met her? He didn't want to consider what his life would be like with her not in it, which was why he was determined to mend their friendship and then take it to the next level. Listening to her now, his smile grew. Clearly, when it came to leading this project, she had plenty of confidence, and as an image of her face filled his mind, he couldn't wait a moment longer to see her. Nathan smoothed down his suit jacket and strode into the kitchen. Chloe's back was to him, but the contractor's was not, and when the man saw him, he straightened from the counter he'd been leaning against and said, "Good morning, Mr. Hewitt." "Hello," Nathan said in reply, and when his eyes went to Chloe's back, he noticed her stiffen ever so slightly. She turned to face him, that cool, professional smile on her lips. "I didn't realize you were stopping by." "Of course." He said it as if it should have been obvious. "I wanted to meet—" His gaze slid to the contractor, who stepped forward with an outstretched hand. "Keith Sampson," the man said. "Nice to meet you, Keith," Nathan said as he shook his hand. "Call me Nathan." Keith nodded as Nathan released his hand. "How are things looking?" Nathan asked, his attention on Keith. "The wall will be removing his weight bearing, so we'll need to add a beam to take the weight of the roof. I'll have an engineer come by to look things over before we remove the supporting posts, but other than that, Chloe's plans are solid, and I look forward to working closely with her." At that, Keith shot a smile at Chloe, who smiled back, and it wasn't the strictly professional smile that she always gave him. An arrow of jealousy shot through Nathan, taking him by surprise. Swallowing down the feeling, he turned his gaze on Chloe. "I'm lucky to have Chloe on my team." Chloe's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, her blue eyes watching him as a small smile lifted her lips. "This is a challenging project, but one I'm thrilled to take on." Then she turned her attention to Keith. "Together, we'll transform this house into something magnificent." Keith grinned at her like they had something special going on, and Nathan felt like he was a third wheel. Annoyed, he had to suppress the urge to tell Keith to get out of his house and never come back. Why was she tormenting Nathan like this? Chloe could see jealousy sparking in his eyes, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. Teasing Nathan had been something she and Lisa had done all the time, but now it felt different, like a step below flirting, like she wanted him to feel some sort of sting. "Tomorrow we start the demo," Chloe said, as she focused on Nathan, silently repeating, "He's a client, just a client." On impulse, she added, "If you have a sledgehammer and a pair of safety glasses, you can join the fun." To her surprise, he said, "What time should I be here?" His eyes went to Keith as he asked his question, and Chloe felt slightly ignored, but she knew he was just attempting to make the point that he hadn't been stung, which she could totally see that he had been. 7 a.m., Keith said, then he chuckled. "I have plenty of tools, Nathan. No need to go out and buy any." Nathan nodded, then he turned to Chloe. "I'll bring the donuts." The way he said it, like he was in charge, annoyed her. She was heading this up. Then, "He's a client, just a client," popped into her mind. Good thing she'd been repeating it so often, or she might have said something rude. Instead, she smiled. "I like chocolate raised." He laughed, his gaze steady on her, which unnerved her slightly. "I know." Then he smiled at Keith. "Nice to meet you. I'll see you first thing." With that, he turned and left. Chloe watched him go. "Nice guy," Keith said from behind her. Chloe turned around. "Yeah." "Is it true?" Keith's eyes narrowed as he spoke. "Is what true?" Was he really on a deserted island all that time? It had never occurred to her to question Nathan's story. "Where else would he be?" she asked. Now Keith's eyebrows rose like he was implying something. "If I were a billionaire and I wanted to disappear for a year, I don't think I'd go to a deserted island." This line of questioning was ridiculous. Everyone knew Nathan's yacht had sunk, killing her baby sister as well as the yacht's captain. How could Nathan have gone anywhere but an island? How would he have gotten there? Not wanting to give oxygen to Keith's absurd line of thinking, Chloe ignored his fishing expedition. "I've got to run, Keith. I'll see you tomorrow." He smiled, his attention fully on her. "I look forward to it." Smirking, because she'd worked with him on many projects, but she'd also made it abundantly clear that she wasn't interested in anything beyond a professional relationship, she walked with him out of the house and locked the door behind them. As she drove away, she couldn't stop her mind from filling in all kinds of blanks as to where Nathan could have been if he hadn't been on a deserted island. But if that was the case, why would he not tell his family he was okay? He had to know how much everyone had worried about him. Deciding this was something she would delve into later, she turned her thoughts to the demolition that would begin the next day, wondering if Nathan would actually come to help. Chapter 14. Carrying a large box of donuts the next morning, Nathan walked past 2 trucks that were parked in the long driveway of his house, as well as Chloe's car. A dumpster sat at the top of the driveway near the front door, and as Nathan approached the open door, he heard banging and crashing. Excited to get to work, he walked inside to find controlled chaos, most of it in the kitchen. 3 men were taking down cabinets and tearing out the countertops. Nathan's eyes went to Chloe, who was overseeing it all. When Chloe saw Nathan walk in wearing dark jeans and a blue t-shirt, she was surprised to feel her pulse increase. And when his eyes met hers, and his lips curved into a smile that would melt the coldest of hearts, her pulse pounded harder. He's a client, just a client. That mantra seemed to be losing its effectiveness, but she repeated the words in her head nevertheless. "Good morning," Nathan said to her, nearly shouting to be heard over the ruckus of the demo. Then he walked right up to her and held out the box of donuts. "Lots of chocolate raised in here." He lowered his voice, but she could still hear him clearly. "Thanks," she said, taking the box from him. Then she turned to the workers. "Who wants a donut?" 2 of the men stopped what they were doing and took a donut from the box. The other man was in the middle of pulling a cabinet down. "Let me help with that," Nathan said to the man before grabbing one side of the cabinet and helping him yank it off the wall. Keith walked into the kitchen. "More help," he said with a smile as he approached Nathan. "Awesome." Chloe couldn't tell if Keith was being facetious or if he really was happy to have Nathan there. "I'm ready to work," Nathan said at a normal volume. All 3 workers were eating donuts, so the work had briefly come to a standstill and the room had quieted. Keith looked skeptical. "Are you sure? We have plenty of people to do the work." Then he chuckled. "That's what you're paying us for." Nathan's lips lifted in a smile. "I don't mind getting my hands dirty." Chloe couldn't help but wonder if Nathan would be so eager to take on the physical labor if she wasn't there. "You're the boss," Keith said with a tight smile. Then he turned to one of the men. "Steve, give Nathan what he needs and show him what to do. Brian, come with me." Then Keith and Brian headed upstairs to work on tearing out the bathrooms. Nathan reached into his back pocket and pulled out a pair of work gloves before tugging them onto his hands. The gloves looked brand new. Chloe held back a smirk as she pictured him buying them after she'd seen him the day before. "That wall needs to come down," Steve said, pointing to the wall between the kitchen and the large space on the other side. Then he handed Nathan a sledgehammer. Somewhat amused, Chloe watched Nathan take the sledge from Steve. Nathan held it horizontally so that the top of the sledge's head was pointed at the wall. Ramming it into the wall, he created a hole, then moved down the wall, creating a kind of daisy chain of holes. Nice, Steve said, clearly impressed with what a man he probably thought of as a spoiled billionaire could do. Nathan barely glanced at Steve, instead focusing on his task. Chloe stayed out of the way, but she found she couldn't drag her gaze from Nathan as he worked. Biceps flexing, he methodically worked, tearing the drywall down. Then, without being told, he scooped up an armful of drywall from the floor and carried it out to the dumpster. Steve and the other worker helped, and soon the kitchen was wide open, except for the posts holding up the ceiling. The physical work of removing the wall felt great. While Nathan had been stuck on that island, he'd had to survive by his wits, which had meant working hard to gather any food he could find. He'd climbed trees to yank ripe fruit off of branches, created makeshift fishing poles to catch fish, and had rapidly rolled sticks against other pieces of wood to create enough friction to start a fire. It had taken enormous trial and error to make all of those things happen, but his survival had depended on it, and he'd risen to the occasion. Now, he was surprised to discover just how much he actually missed the physical labor he'd engaged in every single day on that island. Maybe he was in the wrong line of work. Maybe he should leave Hewitt Consolidated and go into construction. Holding back a smile at the thought, because although he might miss physical labor, that didn't mean he was ready to do it day in and day out, he surveyed the now empty kitchen that was open and spacious. The other workers had all gone upstairs. Nice work, Chloe said as she joined him. Glad she appreciated what he'd done, he turned to her with a grin. Thanks. She tilted her head and narrowed her eyes. I don't remember you being so enthusiastic about manual labor back in college. Did she really think he hadn't changed at all? Suppressing a frown, he said, I'm not the same person I was back then. She stared at him. Can I ask you a question? Thrilled that she was initiating a conversation, he hid his eagerness as he slowly nodded. Sure. What was it like, on that island? He gazed at her as memories poured into his mind and heart. Lonely. The pain and sadness in Nathan's eyes arrowed right into Chloe's heart, and she had no doubt that he was telling the truth about being stuck on that deserted island for a year. She tried to imagine how she would have felt if she were completely alone for that long. It sounded horrible, and she didn't know if she would have been able to go on, especially not knowing if she would ever be found. But Nathan had had no choice, and he'd survived, even if Lisa hadn't. Swallowing over the knot that clogged her throat, Chloe had to look away from Nathan. His experience would forever be tied to the loss of her sister, and she didn't know if she could ever get past that to see the man in front of her. I should probably get to the office, Nathan said, when it became obvious that Chloe was done chatting. Not that it had been much of a chat. Still, it was a start. Smiling, Chloe said, I hope you enjoyed smashing that wall. It looked like you were having fun. I was, actually. She smirked. Maybe Keith should hire you to be on his crew. Nathan laughed. I'll keep that in mind if I need another job. Chloe shook her head, but she was smiling, so that was good. Now that the kitchen's empty, what happens next? When all the demo's done, we'll start creating each room. She paused. I'll need to show you some options for finishes like flooring, cabinets, countertops, backsplashes, that sort of thing. Glad there would be a new excuse to spend time with her, he smiled. Okay, when do we do that? The sooner the better, especially the kitchen cabinets. I need to get those ordered as soon as possible. I can make time tomorrow. Okay. There's a custom cabinet maker I want to use, so I was thinking we could go by his shop and look at some of his work. Nathan could see this turning into a good opportunity. All right, I'll pick you up from your office at 10:30 tomorrow morning. She hesitated, like that hadn't exactly been the plan she was going for, but he'd gotten smarter and knew he needed to lock down what he wanted before she had a chance to change things up. I'll be ready, she finally said, and with that, he told her goodbye before walking out the door. Chapter 15. The next morning, as Chloe sat at her desk waiting for 10:30 to arrive, she felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. The last time she'd been alone with Nathan had been in his office, a place that felt neutral. Today, though, they were going on more of a field trip. Still a neutral location, but they would be together in Nathan's car. She'd wanted to meet him at the cabinet shop, but when he'd said he would pick her up, she'd reminded herself that he was the client and that it would be rude to tell him no. Now, though, she half wished she'd gone ahead and told him she would meet him there. Then again, why did it matter? He was her client. Why couldn't she get that through her head? "Good morning," a familiar male voice said from behind her. Startled, she nearly gasped, but she held it together and turned her head to find Nathan standing behind her. Getting to her feet, she turned and faced him while pushing a professional smile onto her lips. "Hello." Then, as she took in his casual slacks and button-down shirt with the top button undone, an image of his flexing biceps from the day before jumped into her head. Remembering how sexy she thought he looked, she felt a blush climbing her cheeks. To cover that, she turned away and opened a desk drawer to retrieve her purse. "Ready to go?" she asked into the open drawer. "Yep." Once she'd gathered herself, she closed the drawer and straightened to face him, but his handsome face and confident smile nearly undid all the gathering she'd just completed. Softly clearing her throat, Chloe glanced toward the front of the office, which led to the exit. Then she met Nathan's eyes. "Would you like me to drive?" He shook his head. "I'm having too much fun with my new car." "You bought a new car?" "Why does that surprise you?" She pictured the Range Rover he'd had in college. "What was wrong with the car you had?" He grinned. "Not a thing, but I wanted to celebrate my new license with a new car." "Your new license?" Now she sounded like a parrot. He laughed. "The DMV thought I was dead, so my license expired. Had to get a new one." That made sense in a terrible sort of way, and it also reminded her that her sister actually was dead. Not wanting to think about that, she said, "Oh." Nathan swept an arm toward the front of the office. "I'm parked out front." Chloe led the way, and when she stepped onto the sidewalk, she couldn't miss the metallic blue Lamborghini convertible parked at the curb. "Yours?" she threw over her shoulder. He was grinning. "Like it?" She did, although it made her think that he hadn't actually changed at all, that he was still all about fancy cars and having fun. "Pretty color." He walked with her to the passenger side and lifted the door, which opened like a wing. After she'd climbed inside and settled into her seat, he closed her door and got in on his side. Then he flipped up a small cover that hid the ignition switch before pressing the button. The engine roared to life. The summer day was gorgeous, and the sun shining on her felt wonderful. "Nice day for a convertible." He chuckled. "In LA, most days are convertible days. Now, where are we going?" She gave him directions, and off they went. As much as Nathan was enjoying his new car, it was much more fun when Chloe was in the car with him. He spent enough time alone on that island. Glancing at her in the passenger seat, Nathan let a smile of satisfaction curve his lips. "What?" she asked, obviously noting his expression. "Just enjoying the beautiful day." He glanced at her again. "And the company." Her lips twitched like a smile was forthcoming, but she was preventing it from blossoming. "It is a gorgeous day." Noticing that she'd focused only on the weather, he threw his head back and laughed. Now a smile did form on her lips. "The company's not so bad either." Thrilled that they were making progress, Nathan let that stand and turned his attention to the road. Once they reached the cabinet shop, Nathan helped Chloe from his car and they walked inside together. Being with Nathan wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it did surprise Chloe that she was liking it so much. In fact, the more time she spent with him, the more she found herself enjoying his company. It was almost like the old days. Almost. "Hello," she said to Bryant, the owner of the cabinet shop. "This is Nathan." Bryant stepped forward, his hand outstretched to Nathan. "Mr. Hewitt, welcome." "Call me Nathan," Nathan said with a smile. Bryant nodded, then looked at both of them. "What can I help you with?" "We're remodeling Nathan's house," Chloe began, "and we would love to have you build custom cabinetry in his kitchen." "Wonderful. Why don't you come this way and I'll show you some of my work." With that, the three of them went to a showroom-like space where Bryant had several cabinets on display. He talked about the different styles of cabinets, as well as a variety of woods, including stains and colors. "I also have a portfolio here," he said, as he pointed to a thick binder. where you can see some of the kitchens I've completed." "Thank you," Chloe said. "We'll look around, and I'll let you know if we have any questions." With that, he left them alone. Chloe and Nathan sat side by side, thumbing through Bryant's portfolio. Chloe jotted down notes on the cabinet she thought would work best. Finally, she turned to Nathan. "Is there anything we've seen that stands out to you?" "You're the designer. You tell me." Rather pleased that he recognized her expertise and trusted her, she turned the pages of the portfolio until she found her favorite. "What about this one?" He studied the image, reaching out to touch the page as if he could feel the wood. "I like it." She laughed. "Just like it? I want you to love it." He turned his eyes to her, drawing her in a way that caught her off guard. "Okay, I love it." Desperate to get her suddenly frantic pulse under control, she shifted her eyes to the photo. "Are you just saying that to placate me, or do you mean it?" Then she realized that this wasn't the way she normally interacted with clients. This was more like flirting. Just a client. "Chloe." His voice was low and intimate. She lifted her eyes to his, and when she saw the intensity there, she nearly caught her breath. "I don't really care about the cabinets." His voice was soft and his expression sincere. Then he paused, and the moment was filled with an electric current. "I care about you." Chloe didn't know what to say. As much as she tried to deny it, he was much more than a client. Chapter 16. Nathan could tell his words had some sort of effect on Chloe. The question was, what would she do now? Chloe began, but then she turned away. That wasn't good enough. He had to know what she was feeling. "What?" he asked. "What were you going to say?" Her forearms rested on the table, the portfolio binder in front of her, her eyes pointed at the page with the cabinet she'd selected. She tapped the page. "This is the one. This is the cabinet that will go in your kitchen." Disappointed that she'd left his words hanging, but glad that she was still sitting beside him, Nathan put aside the feeling of being rebuffed. Baby steps, he had to remind himself. We are taking baby steps. "Perfect," he said. She turned to him with a smile that held a hint of relief. Because he hadn't pushed her? Okay, maybe with time she would come around. Already they'd made progress. "I'll make the arrangements with Bryant," she said. Then she stood. "But later. It will take some time, and I don't want to keep you." Glad she was handling that part of the process, he said. "I think we should celebrate this big step toward finishing my kitchen by grabbing some lunch." She tilted her head like she wondered if he'd planned for them to go to the cabinet shop mid-morning so that they would finish up at lunchtime. Well, yes, in fact, he had. Then, to his surprise and delight, she nodded. "I can fit a business lunch into my schedule." Ignoring her emphasis on the word business, he stood. "Great." She gazed at him with a look that said, "Don't expect this to happen often." They walked toward the door, with Chloe telling Bryant that she would call him later to schedule the consultation. Once they reached Nathan's Lamborghini, Nathan turned to Chloe. "Would you like to drive?" Her eyebrows shot up. "Your new car?" "Yeah." "You never used to let me drive your Range Rover, and I asked on more than one occasion." He laughed as they stood beside his car. "Maybe I trust your driving skills more now." "Why? For all you know, I've totaled 3 cars in the last year." His eyes widened. "Have you?" She laughed. "No, of course not. Besides, since you haven't driven anything in the last year except, what, herds of fishes? I have more driving experience than you now." He laughed. "They're called schools of fishes, and I didn't actually drive any, but point taken." She laughed right along with him. It was starting to feel a little bit like the good old days. Thrilled, he gestured to the driver's side, and when she began walking in that direction, he followed, opening the door for her and helping her inside. A little nervous to drive such an expensive car, Chloe placed her hands on the steering wheel before attempting to start the engine. "You have to press the start button," Nathan said with a smirk, pointing to the place where she needed to flip open the cover. "I know. I'm just getting a feel for the car first." He smiled. "Take all the time you need." Chloe ran her hands over the leather-covered steering wheel, enjoying the luxurious feel of it. Then she let her gaze slide around the controls on the dashboard. Finally, she lifted the cover over the start button and held the button down until the engine rumbled to life. Loving the feel of being behind the wheel of such an outrageously expensive yet gorgeous and fun car, she couldn't wipe the grin off of her face. She wasn't even annoyed with Nathan for basically strong-arming her into going to lunch with him. "Where do you want to eat?" "I have a place in mind," he said. Then he punched an address into the navigation system. Directions appeared on the screen. "There you go." With a huge grin, Chloe pulled away from the curb, and with the wind blowing in her hair, she followed the directions on the screen. "I have to admit," she said as they flew down the highway, "this car is a blast to drive." His smile matched hers. "I know, that's why I bought it." Soon, they reached the restaurant, and once she parked, Chloe let Nathan help her from the car before walking beside him into the restaurant. It was a place she'd never been, and it was like a garden inside, vines trailing up walls and flowers everywhere. Trying to ignore the romantic vibe, as she and Nathan were seated at a table for two, she smiled at him. "Thank you for letting me drive your car. I think it made up for all those times you told me no when we were in high school and college." He tilted his head. "I should have let you then." She picked up a menu. "Yes, you should have." Then she held back a chuckle as she perused the options. "Nathan Hewitt," a female voice said from behind Chloe. "Is that really you?" Chloe couldn't see who was speaking, but she could see Nathan's reaction to the woman. A broad smile lit his face as he stood. "Misty," he said as he stepped toward the woman, "how are you?" Chloe turned in her seat to check out this Misty that Nathan was so happy to see, but it was hard to get a good look at her since she had her arms around Nathan in a very friendly embrace. Finally, she stepped away. Model, tall, and slender, she was about Chloe's age. Blonde hair cascaded halfway down her back, and her green eyes danced. Wait, she looked familiar. Where had Chloe seen her before? "This is Chloe," Nathan said, gesturing to her. "My interior designer." Now, why did that sting? He was telling the truth, and she'd made it abundantly clear that this was a business lunch. What else did she expect him to say? "Chloe and I used to be close friends until her sister died while on my yacht. Now our relationship is complicated?" No. "Chloe," he went on, "this is Misty." Misty smiled adoringly at Nathan. "Nathan and I knew each other years ago." Now Chloe remembered. There had been a period of time while they'd been in college that Nathan had dated someone mysterious, someone he'd refused to tell Chloe or Lisa about, someone he'd liked quite a lot. And then one night, while Chloe had been out with friends at a dance club, she'd seen Nathan and Misty. He hadn't seen her, though. He'd seemed really into Misty, and when one of Chloe's friends had joked that they should join Nathan and Misty on the dance floor and basically cut in, Chloe had quashed the idea. Seeing him with a mystery woman had sparked the green-eyed monster inside her, and she hadn't liked it. And now the object of that jealousy was standing beside her table. "I'm sorry I haven't stopped by to see you," Misty said, her attention completely on Nathan. "I've been in Europe for the last few months and just got back to the States." "What were you doing in Europe?" "Modeling." Of course she's a model, Chloe thought. Then she stood. "I should probably get back to the office, Nathan." She glanced at Misty with a small smile, then shifted her focus to Nathan. "I'll grab an Uber." Chapter 17. Nathan was losing control of the situation, and Chloe was about to leave. As nice as it was to see Misty, he'd lost interest in her long ago. It was Chloe who held his attention. At Chloe's words, Nathan noticed that Misty's eyebrows had risen as if to say, "You and I can have lunch together." "It was good to see you, Misty," Nathan said in a friendly but firm tone. Disappointment was plain on her face, but she'd never been one to beg, so after giving him another hug, she said, "Good to see you too. Perhaps we can get together and catch up." "Yeah," he said, without really meaning it. "Take care." She strode away, and Nathan turned back to Chloe. "I'd still like to have lunch with you." Chloe seemed to consider it. "I suppose." She sat back in her seat, and, relieved, Nathan sat across from her. A few moments later, their server took their order, and as they waited for their food to arrive, Nathan scrambled for something to say that would cover the slightly awkward feeling that seemed to linger around their table. Before he had a chance to open his mouth, Chloe spoke. "Why did you stop dating Misty?" Startled by the question, because it was so long ago that he didn't know why it mattered, he narrowed his eyes. "Why do you want to know?" She lifted her shoulders in a shrug. "Just curious." Then she smirked. "I just remembered that you never introduced her to me or Lisa, and I thought that was kind of interesting." He laughed. "Was I supposed to run every date by you too?" Chloe realized she was speaking about Lisa without the usual grief and anger that accompanied the mention of her name, particularly in Nathan's presence. Kind of shocked, but immensely pleased, she said, "Of course you were. We needed to make sure the girl wasn't just interested in you for your—" "Good looks?" Nathan asked, cutting her off with a grin. She burst out laughing, and for a moment it felt like old times. "Yeah, that's it." Then she shook her head. "You're not that hot." Then she thought, "Total lie." "I was going to say for your money, but you knew that." Nathan pressed a hand to his heart in mock pain. "I'm hurt that you think a woman would only be interested in me for my money." Then he frowned. "And even more deeply hurt that you don't think I'm attractive." That was so far from the truth that Chloe had to look away, focusing her attention on the napkin in her lap, which she straightened. He was the hottest man she knew. "Here you go," the server said as she placed their plates in front of them. Glad for the distraction, Chloe picked up her fork and used it to mix the slices of chicken with the lettuce in the salad. "Was Misty a model when you dated her?" Why was she asking that? But she knew why. Misty was stunning, and Chloe had to know why Nathan had stopped seeing her. "Yes," he said after he swallowed the bite of burger he'd been chewing. "Why?" "Just curious." He set the burger on his plate. "You seem to be quite curious about Misty." He narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Just because she'd asked 2 questions about her didn't make her curious, did it? Well, of course it did, but she didn't want to admit that. "Just making conversation," she said, before popping a chunk of chicken into her mouth. Surprised that Chloe had any interest in someone he dated long ago, Nathan pressed her for a better answer. "How's this for conversation?" he said, as he stared right at her. "Why aren't you dating anyone?" Her eyebrows rose. "Who said I'm not?" "Are you?" From the little investigating he'd done, primarily stalking her on social media, he determined that she was single. Then again, maybe she wasn't one to share those things on social media. "Why do you want to know?" Her deflection only seemed to confirm his assumption. With a smug smile, he said, "Just curious." Her lips twitched like she was trying to hold back a smile. "Guess I'm not the only curious one." Suddenly, he remembered a game he used to play with her and Lisa called Truth. One person would ask a question, and the person being asked would have to answer honestly. Or sometimes they would just end a sentence with the word truth to show they weren't joking. "Let's play Truth." Her eyes widened in obvious surprise as she stared at him. "Only if I go first." That was fine with him, as long as she was willing to play. "Deal. What's your question?" "Why did you stop dating Misty?" Chloe asked. Then she wondered if she actually cared, or had she just wasted her first question. Too late now. Nathan's eyebrows tugged together like he wasn't sure he really wanted to play this game, but it had been his idea, and Chloe knew he had questions he wanted to ask her, so he would answer this one. And the fact that he was hesitating made her even more curious. He audibly exhaled. "She became hyper-focused on her modeling career and, decided she didn't have time for me." "Wait," Chloe said, shocked. "Are you saying she broke up with you?" Nathan looked around like he was afraid someone had overheard, then he grinned. "Hard to believe, I know." It kind of was, and knowing that Nathan hadn't been the one to break it off, added to the fact that Misty's interest seemed to have been rekindled, ignited that familiar feeling of being attracted to Nathan while knowing he would never be hers. Trying to smother the unpleasant sensation of helplessness and vulnerability, Chloe pushed a smile onto her lips. "Very funny." Nathan straightened in his seat. "My turn." Now sort of dreading what he was going to ask, Chloe looked at him with expectation. Are you dating anyone? That was a simple question with a simple answer, although Chloe couldn't help but wonder why he was asking. No, I'm not. Nathan slowly nodded, like he was filing away that information. Your turn. Okay. Why do you want to know if I'm single? He grinned. I don't think I've made it a secret that I want to go out with you. That was certainly true, although with her old insecurity surfacing, it was easy to be suspicious of his motives. So you're saying... She let the words trail off. He stared at her in silence, then a soft smile curved his lips. Will you let me take you to dinner? And I don't mean a business dinner. I mean an actual date. All at once, Chloe pictured Nathan asking Lisa to go on his yacht with him and her sister happily agreeing, having no idea she wouldn't survive the trip. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. How could she agree to go on a date with him when Lisa's last date with him ended in tragedy? I don't think that's a good idea, she finally said. What do you mean? It's a great idea. Why couldn't he just let it go? Why did he have to keep pushing? I'm sorry, Nathan, but no. A look of acceptance flashed across his face. Okay, I get it, and I apologize for continually asking you when you obviously have no desire to go out with me. A muscle worked in his jaw. I won't ask again. Panic swept over Chloe. She actually had a lot of desire to go out with him, but she just couldn't push herself past the block of her memories and feelings. And now he would never ask her again? Perhaps reading the indecision on her face, he asked, Is that what you want? Were they still playing truth? Yeah, she heard herself say, I think that's best. Then she thought, Quiet! Stop digging a deeper hole. Nathan's lips flattened as if he wasn't happy with that answer. Neither was she, but she couldn't bring herself to change it. After that, they stopped playing truth. Instead, as they ate, Chloe talked about the house project, with Nathan responding in such a way that made her think he didn't care as much about it as she did. Are you excited to get this project done so you can move in? She asked, gauging whether her instincts were correct. Yeah, sure, but it's going to take several months for it all to come together, isn't it? The lack of enthusiasm in his tone only confirmed her suspicions. Yes, it will definitely take some time to make all the changes. She softly chuckled. We are renovating the entire house. She paused. Your parents don't mind you living there while the work's going on? He tilted his head. Have you met my mother? That made her laugh. She did know his mother, and she was also confident that his mother would be happy if he never moved out, not after he'd basically come back from the dead. He grinned. Exactly. They reminisced about growing up together, even talking about Lisa and some of her shenanigans. In the back of Chloe's mind, she realized that talking about Lisa with Nathan was becoming easier, and right at that moment, being with Nathan felt so natural and easy, just like old times. Why couldn't it always feel like that? Why was she letting that block stay in place, the one that wouldn't allow her to take a step toward what she really wanted, namely, a deeper, richer, and possibly romantic relationship with Nathan Hewitt? Once they finished lunch, Nathan drove her back to her office, and as they stood on the sidewalk outside of the entrance, he said, If you need my input on anything, don't hesitate to contact me. He was all business, and though she half expected him to ask her out again, when he didn't, she was a little disappointed. Take care, he said with a smile, before striding away from her and getting into his Lamborghini and driving away. She watched him go, mentally listing the times she would need to consult with him about his house. Chapter 18. He let me drive his brand new Lamborghini, Chloe said to Hannah, as she sat on the couch in Hannah's spacious living room that evening. Hannah smiled. Nice. And we ran into an old girlfriend of his at the restaurant. Eyebrows rising into her hairline, Hannah said, Really? Tell me more. Chloe replayed the interchange at the restaurant, including playing truth and ending with Nathan's statement that he wouldn't ask her out anymore. I thought you liked Nathan, Hannah said. From what you've told me, you've always had a crush on him. I do. Then she corrected herself. I did. So you don't now? Chloe leaned her head against the couch, closed her eyes, and audibly sighed. I don't know what I'm feeling anymore. She straightened and looked at Hannah. It's all tangled up with Lisa and what happened to her. So, Hannah began, because of what happened to her, you're not allowed to be happy? Was that what it was? Did she feel guilty for being alive? Did she feel guilty that her life was going on without her sister? Was she sabotaging her chances of finding happiness because Lisa never would? At some point you need to move past that, Hannah said. Really move past that. Chloe knew that was true, but knowing wasn't the same as doing. I know. Hannah gave her a look that said, You say you know, but you're not doing anything to change your reality. Anyway, Hannah said, I want to hear more about this chick that showed up. Misty, Chloe said, although she didn't like thinking about her. Right. Do you know her last name? Maybe we can Google her. Regretting that she hadn't gotten that information from Nathan, she shook her head, then chuckled. We could Google Misty the model. Hannah immediately picked up her phone and began typing. Seconds later, she held her phone out to Chloe. Recognize any of these women? Chloe took Hannah's phone and scrolled through the images. Not 2 seconds later, her heart lurched with jealousy. That's her. She pointed to the image of Misty. Hannah took the phone from Chloe, her gaze glued to the screen. Wow, she's gorgeous. That wasn't what Chloe wanted to hear. I know. Hannah set her phone down and looked at Chloe. So, she broke up with Nathan? Yep. Huh. What are you thinking? Hannah tucked her legs underneath her on the couch. It sounds like this Misty wants to start things back up with Nathan. Hannah narrowed her eyes. How do you feel about that? I don't love it. Hannah rolled her eyes. Truth be told, Chloe hated the idea. Hated it. But that wasn't fair to Nathan. Chloe had made it abundantly clear, on more than one occasion, that she wanted nothing to do with dating Nathan. As such, she had no right, none, to have a say on who he dated. Why are you rolling your eyes? Chloe asked. Softly laughing, Hannah shook her head. I feel sorry for Nathan. That wasn't what she'd expected Hannah to say. Why do you feel sorry for him? The man's a billionaire who got a second chance at life. Then Chloe smirked. And he has a pretty sweet car. Chloe, the man's obviously sweet on you, but you refuse to see it. Was that true? Yes, he'd asked her out multiple times, but... Chloe's forehead furrowed. Had she been so focused on how she was feeling that she'd ignored the signals Nathan had been sending? Signals that were kind of like flares. Signals that were hard to miss unless the person who was supposed to see them was wearing blinders of self-imposed restrictions on happiness. Is that a light bulb coming on? Hannah asked with a grin. Chloe wasn't completely ready to accept that Nathan wasn't just trying to make up for taking her sister away and trying to assuage his guilt. Maybe? Maybe, Hannah echoed, her tone showing her disdain. Why can't you see it? Why now? Chloe asked. Why not back in college when I would have given anything for him to see me that way? Doubts crowded in once again. I think he's just trying to ease the guilt he feels for being responsible for Lisa's death. And who better to alleviate it with than me, Lisa's sister, because if I forgive him, then he can go on his merry way and not think about her anymore. Then, as her thought completed, she knew she'd done the right thing in telling him she wasn't interested. And then once I've fallen under his spell and forgiven him, and he goes on his merry way, I'll be left with a broken heart. She shook her head. No, I can't do that. Hannah frowned. All right, I can see why you're reluctant. Tired of thinking about it, she turned the conversation in another direction. Alone that evening, Nathan soaked in the jacuzzi in his parents' backyard. Taking in the nighttime view, he reflected on his day. It had begun with so much promise. He'd enjoyed looking at cabinets with Chloe, then had loved watching her have a blast as she driven his car, and then she'd agreed to have lunch with him, albeit a business lunch. Even so, when they'd sat together at that table, it hadn't felt like business, not after that carefree car ride. It had almost felt like a date. And then Misty had shown up. He admitted that he found her as stunning as ever, but the timing of her arrival couldn't have been any worse. Fortunately, he'd managed to avert the disaster of Chloe walking out, but then they'd played that stupid game of truth, and now he'd committed to never asking her out again. Of course it was the right thing to do, because if she didn't want him asking her out, he had to respect that. But oh, how he wanted much more than mere friendship with her. He couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't get her gorgeous smile and twinkling eyes and bubbly personality out of his mind. Why hadn't he noticed those things before? But he knew why. He'd been too focused on having a good time to pay attention to what was right in front of him. And now it was too late, because she clearly still held Lisa's death against him. It was like perfect karma that now that he'd found someone he really connected with, someone he knew didn't care about his wealth, someone who actually cared about him, that person was out of reach, all because Lisa had come on that cruise. And even though he'd survived that terrible shipwreck, his chance of finding true happiness seemed to be slipping through his fingers like the sand on the beach where he'd spent the last year. It was like he'd survived only to be punished later for that very survival. "Hey there, handsome," a sexy female voice said from behind him. Startled, Nathan turned to see who the voice belonged to, although he already knew, and when he saw Misty standing beside the jacuzzi, he had to work to hide the mix of surprise and annoyance. "Hey," he said, moving to a different seat in the jacuzzi so he was facing her. She was wearing a sleeveless dress, and as she slipped off her sandals and moved to the edge of the jacuzzi, Nathan wondered what she was doing there. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, as she pulled her dress up to her knees, sat on the edge of the jacuzzi, letting her bare legs dangle into the steaming water. "Not at all," he said, half meaning it. Any hope of more than friendship with Chloe, and even that was strained at times, didn't seem possible. But that didn't mean he had to be completely alone. Misty was clearly interested, and to be honest, he was lonely, desperately lonely. Misty slowly swished her legs in the water. "I didn't get a chance to tell you at the restaurant how thrilled I was when I heard that you'd been found." That was more than Chloe had ever said to him, and his heart warmed at Misty's words. "Thank you. I appreciate that. I really do." Misty smiled the smile that he'd fallen for back in college, but it didn't have the same effect on him that Chloe's smile did. Chloe's came from somewhere deep inside, lighting up her entire countenance and brightening Nathan to his very core every time he saw it. But Chloe wasn't there. She hadn't come to see him, hadn't told him how thrilled she was that he was alive. For the most part, she'd barely seemed to tolerate him. He needed to focus on who was sitting in front of him and stop thinking about Chloe James. Chapter 19. A week later, while sitting at her desk, Chloe received a text from Hannah. From Hannah. "I'm not sure if you've seen this, or even if you want to know about it, but I think you should. Love you." Chloe clicked on the link that Hannah had included, which took her to a website that featured stories and pictures of celebrities. Staring back at her was the smiling face of Nathan, with his arm around Misty's waist. Nathan wore a tux, and Misty wore a stunning emerald green ball gown. Her blonde hair was swept up in a sophisticated hairstyle, and diamonds dripped from her ears. The story said the couple had attended a charity event together the night before, and there was speculation that Nathan had a new girlfriend. Staring at the photo, Chloe felt her heart contract with jealousy and frustration, but the frustration was aimed at herself. If she'd accepted even one of Nathan's invitations to go out, perhaps it could have been her standing by his side at the charity event. He would like that, she told herself, because then he could show the world that the sister of the dead girl wasn't holding her death against him. Why did she believe so strongly that Nathan had ulterior motives in asking her out? Resting her chin on her cupped hand, she thought it over. Then a swell of feelings crashed over her, and she knew. In all the years she'd known him, he'd never once shown any romantic interest in her. It was suspicious that he suddenly had that interest now. She didn't trust him, not like she had before. She closed the website and turned her focus back to what she'd been doing, which was creating a design for another client. Which reminded her, she needed to go to Nathan's house that afternoon and check on the progress. Later that afternoon, when Chloe pulled up to Nathan's house, it was clear that much was happening. Several trucks were parked in the driveway, and after Chloe parked her car and walked toward the house, she could hear power tools. Excited to see how much the workers had gotten done since she'd stopped by several days earlier, she strode through the open door with a smile. The moment she walked in, her eyes were drawn to the far side of the spacious room, where floor-to-ceiling sliding doors captured the magnificent view of the green hills spread out below the property. Walking across the room, which had yet to have the flooring installed, Chloe approached the sliding doors and inspected the work-in-progress backyard. A spacious patio with a coffered ceiling above it was going in outside the sliders. An outdoor kitchen and a large fireplace would be going in as well, and nearby, an infinity pool was being installed. The backyard would be an oasis. Nathan would love it. Then an image of Misty crowded into her mind. Would she come over and enjoy all of the amenities as well? Bristling at the idea that all of Chloe's hard work would be enjoyed by another woman, Chloe had to mentally shake herself and let that old mantra, "He's a client, just a client," fill her mind. "What do you think?" Keith asked from behind her. Chloe spun around and smiled at the contractor. "It's looking fabulous. Nathan will love it." Keith grinned. "That's what I like to hear." Then he frowned. "We do have a problem, though. I was about to call you, so I'm glad you came by." A pit of dread filled her stomach. It seemed that there were always some sort of problems on these large projects. "What is it?" Keith motioned with his head for her to follow him. She did, and they entered a nearby room where Keith used a screwdriver to poke at an exposed stud on an exterior wall. The wood had long grooves in it, and the screwdriver went right into it, like the wood was soft and brittle. "Termites?" Chloe asked. This wasn't the first time she'd worked on a house that had that issue. "Yep." "Great. We'll have to stop work and tent the house, then replace all of these studs, as well as look for other places where damage has to be repaired." Trying not to roll her eyes, she said, "Wonderful. Just give me the word, and we'll move forward on mitigation and repairs." Chloe knew she should tell Nathan what was going on, but she dreaded making the call. They hadn't spoken since going to lunch the week before, and now that the old familiar feeling of being overlooked in favor of someone else was back, she really didn't want to have to face him. "He's a client, just a client. Yeah, right." She smiled at Keith. "Go ahead and get started, and I'll let Nathan know what's going on." Knowing she had no choice but to call Nathan, Chloe left Keith to deal with the issue and headed toward the front door. But the need to call Nathan vanished when she found him looking out the floor-to-ceiling sliders. And standing right beside him, wearing a stylish outfit and looking gorgeous, was Misty. Their backs were to Chloe, which gave her a moment to gather herself before making her presence known. She also took that moment to look Nathan over. He was wearing dark jeans and a blazer, which emphasized his broad shoulders and narrow waist. "Hello," Chloe said, and when Nathan turned and saw her, his eyes lit up and a broad smile curved his mouth. Rather surprised that he seemed so genuinely happy to see her, she wondered if she should reevaluate her assumptions. Maybe his interest in her was sincere. Then Misty slid her arm around Nathan's waist in a possessive manner, shoving down any softened feelings that Chloe had begun to have. When Nathan had decided to come by and see how things were looking at his house, he'd hoped he would run into Chloe, although he hadn't really thought she would be there. So when Misty had insisted on coming with him to see the house, he'd agreed. Now, though, with Chloe standing right there, looking beautiful in her form-fitting slacks and sky-blue shirt that matched her eyes, he really, really wished he'd told Misty no. Ah well, it was too late now. Then Misty put her arm around his waist like he was her boyfriend. They'd gone out a couple of times, but that was it. Though he only wanted friendship with her, he knew she was hoping for more. And honestly, being around someone who so desperately wanted to be with him lifted his spirits. "Hi there," Nathan said to Chloe. Then, wanting to extricate himself from Misty's embrace, he turned to the side to look out the floor-to-ceiling sliders, and to his relief, Misty's arm fell away. He stepped closer to the sliders, then turned to look at Chloe. "Putting these in was a stroke of genius." "Thanks," she said with a smile. "I'm really pleased with the way they turned out." "The view is amazing," Misty said, as she moved to Nathan's side before beaming an adoring smile on him. I can't wait to see the rest of the house." Not wanting to be rude, Nathan smiled at her, but then he shifted his attention back to Chloe, who he caught looking at Misty with slightly narrowed eyes. Chloe wondered why Nathan had brought Misty there, but the answer was obvious, because it was his house. Chloe only felt possessive over it because it was her project. "Will you give me a tour?" Misty asked Nathan, with that adoring look that was beginning to get on Chloe's nerves. "Sure," he said, as he smiled at her. "Before you go," Chloe began, glad she had something of substance to discuss with Nathan that had nothing to do with Misty. In fact, she pictured a look of disgust that was sure to cross Misty's face at the word termite. "Yeah?" Nathan said, his eyes focused completely on Chloe. "Keith ran into a problem today that I wanted to let you know about." Nathan's eyebrows furrowed. "Okay." "Evidently there's an issue with termites." Chloe's gaze shifted to Misty, and just as she'd suspected, Misty had scrunched up her nose as if she'd found one of the critters nestled in her salad. Chloe held back a snort of laughter. "That's not good." Chloe focused back on Nathan. "Keith has it under control." Then she explained how the problem would be dealt with. "Sounds like you two are on top of it." "Absolutely." Nathan smiled at her, his gray eyes watching her intently, and for a moment, it felt like it was just the two of them. "I'd love to see the house," Misty said, destroying the moment. Nathan turned to her. "I think Chloe should give us a tour." He looked Chloe's way. "Then she can tell you what it's going to look like." Spending another minute with Misty, let alone the half-hour a tour would take, sounded like torture. Then Chloe reminded herself that Nathan was the client, so she plastered a smile onto her mouth, swept her arm out in a right-this-way gesture, and said, "Please, come this way." After Misty walked past her, Chloe couldn't help throwing Nathan a glare. She hadn't meant for him to see it, but his attention had shifted to her at just that moment, and when their eyes met, his eyebrows shot up in question. Forcing her lips to yank upward into the semblance of a smile, she turned her back on him and followed Misty, saying, "To your left is where the kitchen will be." Chapter 20. What was that glare all about? Nathan wondered, as he listened to Chloe go into great detail about where the cabinets, appliances, and 2 sinks would go. Was Chloe annoyed that he'd brought Misty to his house? It sure seemed that way. But what the heck? She'd flat out told him to stop asking her out, so she obviously had no romantic interest in him. Confused, he turned his attention to Misty, who was beginning to look bored by all that Chloe was explaining. Then Nathan shifted his focus to Chloe, who seemed on the verge of smirking. And then he knew. She was trying to drive Misty away with her deluge of details. A laugh climbed Nathan's throat, and he had to cough to stop its progress. Misty's phone rang in her purse. "Excuse me," Misty said, with a look of relief as she hurried into another room. When he and Chloe were alone, Nathan couldn't stop himself from saying, "I don't think you need to go into quite so much detail." A look of feigned innocence blossomed on her face, and she touched her chest with her hand. "You don't think I'm boring her, do you?" Now Nathan couldn't stop his chuckle. "Maybe a little." Chloe's lips pursed as she shrugged. "So sorry." Nathan grinned. "No, you're not." A devilish smile curved Chloe's mouth. "No, I'm not." Then a look of chagrin came over her, like she just remembered that she was working for him. "I'll try to keep the rest of the tour brief." He was about to tell her that it was actually pretty entertaining to watch, but before he opened his mouth, Misty came back in the room and stopped in front of Nathan. "I apologize, love, but I have to get going." Her attention was completely on him. It was as if Chloe wasn't in the room. That bothered Nathan. He didn't much like her calling him love, either. She never had before. Was she trying to make a point to Chloe? Did she feel threatened by Chloe? Nathan had to hold back a frown. Misty should feel threatened by Chloe, because Chloe was the one he wanted to be with, not Misty. Too bad Chloe didn't feel the same. "Can you take me back to your office so I can get my car?" Misty asked him. He preferred to stay with Chloe, so he made a split-second decision. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the key fob to his Lamborghini and held it out to Misty. Take my car and leave it at the office. I'll pick it up later. Misty looked at the key fob in his hand, then she looked at him, and then she glanced at Chloe before meeting his eyes again. Are you sure? Nathan had no doubt that she wanted him to come with her, but he had other plans. I need to check out the issue with the termites. A look of disgust swept across her pretty face, but there was nothing she could do. She had already stated that she had to leave. With a look of uncertainty, she lifted the key fob from his hand, then she smiled coyly at him and slid her hand into his. Walk me out? Sure. With that, he let her lead him to the front door. The moment Chloe heard the door close, she hustled to the front window. She had to know if Nathan would kiss Misty. Why she felt the need to spy on them, she didn't know. Maybe she just wanted to torture herself. Hoping the men working on the house would stay where they were in other parts of the house and not notice what she was doing, she stood off to one side of the front window where she could see Nathan and Misty and hopefully not be seen. Hand in hand, they strolled to Nathan's metallic blue Lamborghini, stopping next to the driver's side. They chatted for a few moments, and then Nathan opened the wing door, which completely blocked them from Chloe's view. Mouth falling open as she made a scoffing sound, Chloe didn't know what to do. Eager to see what was happening, she moved to a different place, but she still couldn't see anything. That darn door was too big, and they were standing in just the right spot to remain hidden. Frustrated, Chloe considered dashing to an upstairs room that overlooked the driveway, but by then it would be too late to see anything. Sure enough, 20 seconds later the car door came down. At that moment, Chloe was standing right in the middle of the huge plate glass window, and as she stood there dumbly, Nathan looked her way. Their eyes met. She'd been caught. Softly groaning in embarrassment, she scurried back to the kitchen, which was just bare walls, and when she heard the front door open and close, she took a calming breath as she prepared to face Nathan. Glad that he could finally be alone with Chloe, at least as alone as one could be when several men were working in various places in the house, Nathan smiled when he pictured Chloe standing at the front window, obviously watching him and Misty. Had Chloe seen Misty attempt to kiss him, and the way he'd avoided that, giving her a hug instead? And why had she been watching? Nathan walked across the main living space, glancing toward the window where Chloe had been standing moments earlier. Where had she gone? Chloe? In the kitchen. He strode into the space that would soon become his kitchen. What are you doing? Nothing was in the room, and Chloe didn't appear to be doing anything, except trying to pretend she'd been there the whole time. She stammered, picturing how your new cabinets will look once they're installed. Then she gave him a smile that seemed to be an attempt to show her complete innocence. And? His one-word question seemed to confuse her. And what? How will the cabinets look? Oh, right. They'll look fabulous. Softly chuckling, he shook his head. What, you don't believe me? Chloe, why were you watching me and Misty? Her mouth fell open like that was an absurd suggestion. I don't know what you're talking about. Uh-huh. She tilted her head, really playing up the innocent act. I saw you, standing at the window when I was outside with Misty. She was silent, evidently coming up with some sort of excuse, and then she said, I was just seeing if the other workers had arrived yet. With raised eyebrows, she smiled. But he wasn't buying it. What other workers? The ones who are coming to help. Deciding to drop it, because obviously she wasn't going to confess the real reason she'd been watching, Nathan smiled. Show me the termite damage. Relief flashed across her face. All right. She led the way to a room where Keith was overseeing the removal of drywall. How's it going? She asked him. Keith stopped what he was doing and came over to them, shaking Nathan's hand. The infestation doesn't look like it's as bad as we thought. Keith looked between Nathan and Chloe. But we'll still need to mitigate the issue. I've already called a specialist to come take a look. Sounds like you have it handled, Nathan said, glad experts were taking care of it. Keith showed him the damage he'd uncovered earlier, and after chatting about it for a few minutes, Nathan and Chloe walked back to the main living space, stopping in front of the floor-to-ceiling sliders. I'll call an Uber to pick me up." "Don't be silly," Chloe said as she waved her hand. "I can drop you off at your office." Surprised, yet pleased that she'd offered, he smiled. "Thank you. I would appreciate that." Chloe asked herself what she was doing offering Nathan a ride. It was as if her mouth had taken over her head, and now she was committed. Or maybe she should be committed. Holding down the laugh that tickled the back of her throat, she smiled. "No problem." Then she smirked. "I have to admit, I was kind of surprised that you let Misty take your car." She paused as she prepared to ask a leading question without actually asking. "She must be special to you." Nathan stared at her, then he grinned. "You couldn't see us, could you?" Embarrassed that he'd figured her out, she took a step back and made a scoffing sound. "That again?" His shoulders began to shake with laughter. "Chloe, you're a terrible liar." She glared at him. "You're calling me a liar?" Even though it was true, she didn't like being called out on it. His laughter finally subsided, but in response to her question, he just smiled as he shook his head. "If you insist that you weren't watching me with Misty, then I believe you." "What if I was?" she heard herself ask, then thought, "What are you doing?" Nathan's head tipped to the side. "Shall we play truth?" Time to own it. "No need. I admit it. I was watching you guys." "Why?" "I was curious." "About what?" The intensity of his gray eyes on her warmed her, and she had to turn away. Then she pictured the way Misty had put her arm around Nathan, as if to say, "He's mine." That memory was quickly followed by Chloe's imagination conjuring up an image of Nathan giving Misty a lingering kiss. "What were you curious about, Chloe? Truth." She turned to face him, desperate to know how he felt about Misty, because that played into how he felt about her. "I was curious to know if—" Her gaze fell to his lips before lifting to his eyes. "If you kissed her." Nathan's lips curved into a knowing smile, while his eyes were locked on hers. "You mean like this?" Then, to Chloe's stunned surprise, he leaned toward her and pressed his mouth to hers. Her lips softened, and she let the kiss take her away. But then she came to her senses, and when Nathan stepped back, she let her instincts take over, and those instincts had her lifting her hand and slapping him across the face. Nathan's eyes widened, and Chloe gasped. And then she heard a noise from behind her. She turned and saw Keith. His face was beet red. He must have seen the whole thing. Mortified, Chloe wanted to sink into the floor. "Excuse me," Keith said, before turning and hurrying away. Not sure if she should apologize to Nathan for slapping him or yell at him for kissing her when she was on the job, all she knew was that she couldn't face him, and that she really, really liked that kiss. Maybe kissing Chloe hadn't been the best idea, and Nathan could tell she was discombobulated by it. Did that mean she liked the kiss, or hated him for embarrassing her in front of Keith? The slap only confused the issue. Okay, maybe the slap meant she hated him. It had seemed instinctual, so maybe that was the way she felt deep down. And clearly it wasn't that deep, because that hand had come up pretty darn fast. Regardless, Nathan had enjoyed their kiss. He hadn't planned on kissing her, but that look on her face when she'd admitted that she'd been curious about whether or not he'd kissed Misty was more than he'd been able to resist. She had looked forlorn and adorable all at the same time, and he could see in her eyes that those emotions had been genuine. Now, though, he needed to make this right. He'd overstepped his bounds. "I'm sorry, Chloe. That was uncalled for and clearly not wanted." He had to work not to clench his jaw. "I'll find my own way back to my office." Then, not giving her a chance to argue, because he was her client after all, so she would probably insist on taking him to his office even if she no longer wanted to, he turned and walked away, striding across the room and out the front door. Chapter 21. Once again, Chloe found herself standing at the living room window, this time watching Nathan on his phone as he presumably called an Uber. His back was to her, although she wasn't sure she cared if he knew she was watching. Everything had happened so quickly. The kiss, the slap, the apology, his departure. Chloe needed time to process it all. Why had he kissed her? And then she realized that he had never told her whether or not he'd kissed Misty. But why would he have kissed her if he was into Misty? It was all so confusing, and her slapping him hadn't helped. It had startled both of them and had led to his apology and quick exit. Now what? She had no idea, but after a brief word with Keith, and after making sure Nathan was gone, Chloe gathered her things and hustled out to her car before calling Hannah. "He did not kiss you," Hannah said, after Chloe had told her about the incident. "He totally did." Still rather stunned by the out-of-the-blue kiss, when Chloe remembered the way it had felt to have Nathan's mouth claim hers, she felt warm and fuzzy all over again. But then she remembered the way she'd reacted. "And then I slapped him." A loud gasp could be heard over her car's speakers. "No." "Oh yeah, I did. And to top it all off, I'm pretty sure Keith saw everything." She thought about the way the contractor had avoided looking at her after she'd gone to speak to him, as if he was more embarrassed than she was. "What did Nathan do after you slapped him?" Softly sighing at the mess that her already complicated relationship with Nathan Hewitt had become, Chloe said, "He apologized, then fled." "Okay, forgetting all the negative parts." She laughed, and there are quite a few. Then she paused. "How was the kiss?" Laughing, Chloe shook her head. "I can always count on you to cut right to what's most important." "What are friends for?" "Exactly." "So?" "I wasn't disappointed." "Why does that not surprise me, Chloe?" "Oh yeah, because you like the guy." She snickered, despite your impulse to slap him. A blush climbed Chloe's cheeks. She'd slapped a client. Then a frightening thought came to mind. What if Nathan complained to Samantha? It was true that she'd had every right to slap him since he'd kissed her without her permission, but still, what if he fired their firm? Yes, they could sue him, but the man was a billionaire and their firm was small. It wouldn't be worth the money it would cost. If he fired her, it would be a disaster financially and for their reputation. She had to fix this. But how? "What should I do, Hannah?" Desperation laced her voice. "Why do you sound worried all of a sudden?" Chloe shared her fears. "That would be bad." "I know. So how can I fix it?" "Don't panic." But Chloe was already picturing how everything could quickly go south. She didn't want to get embroiled in a scandal, and she didn't want to lose her job. "First off," Hannah said, her tone calm, which helped to calm Chloe, "I don't think Nathan will fire you. It's not like you broke his jaw or something." Then she paused. "You didn't hit him very hard, did you?" "Of course not. It's not like I balled up my fist and punched him in the mouth. It was an open-handed slap. In fact, now that I think about it, he seemed super contrite about the whole thing. Okay, he's not going to fire me." "All right, good." Hannah audibly sighed. "I think you should give it a day or two before you do anything. Give him a chance to reach out to you." Chloe pulled onto her street, already feeling better about everything. "You're right, Hannah. I'm overreacting." "You? No." That brought a smile to Chloe's face. "I'm just getting home. Thanks for the pep talk. I'll let you know if I hear from Nathan." "Okay. Love ya." "Bye." Chloe tapped the screen on the console to end the call. Then she parked her car and went inside her condo, her thoughts on Nathan. Was he thinking about what had happened? Nathan couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. That kiss had been the most amazing kiss he'd ever experienced, and the way she'd melted into him? Yeah, he'd liked that. Until the melting had stopped and the slap had come. He hadn't liked that at all. And it wasn't because it had hurt. It had barely stung. He hadn't liked it because of what it had meant. Although, to be honest, with the mixed signals Chloe had sent, melting into him one second, slapping him the next, he really didn't know what she wanted, and he suspected she didn't know either. Shaking his head, he wanted nothing more than to talk to Chloe and find out what was going on in her head. The question was, should he talk to her right away, or give her some time? When he thought about the yachting accident and how his life had been altered in a moment, He knew he didn't want to wait to talk to her. Well, he would wait until the next day, but that was all. Life was too fragile to put things on hold. Chapter 22. The next day, Saturday, Chloe spent the morning cleaning her condo. It was a weekly ritual that helped her feel grounded and on top of things. Normally. Today, though, all she could think about was Nathan and the way it had felt to have his lips touching hers. Definitely not something that made her feel in control. Quite the opposite, in fact. For years, she'd crushed on Nathan, with varying levels of crushiness depending on what was going on in her life. If she was dating, how much she liked the guy, that type of thing. But after Nathan and Lisa had disappeared on his yacht, and then after Lisa's body had been found, that crush had morphed into anger. Now, though, after spending time with Nathan, she was softening toward him, and the flame that had been nearly extinguished had grown into a small but brightly glowing ember. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. In a way, it felt like a betrayal of Lisa, but it also felt good, like maybe she would finally be able to truly move on with her life. Lost in thought, she pushed the vacuum across the carpet, back and forth, back and forth. Several minutes later, she realized she was going over the same area. With an audible sigh, she turned off the vacuum and put it away. Then she took out dust rags and dusting spray. Halfway through the job, someone rang her doorbell. Chloe had yet to shower and was wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and come on, she was right in the middle of cleaning. She really didn't want to deal with a salesman, so she ignored the doorbell and kept cleaning. Then the person knocked, loud and strong. Feeling highly annoyed, Chloe went to the door, ready to yell at the salesperson to take a hint and go away. Lips compressed, she yanked the door open, but when she saw Nathan standing there holding a large gift basket in one hand and a bouquet of flowers in the other, while wearing a sunny smile, all her annoyance evaporated, replaced by stark surprise. Then she became self-conscious. She'd been working hard, and she probably smelled like she needed a shower, and she was still holding a dust rag and the dusting spray. "Good morning," he said, his eyes focused on her face, which she was grateful for, since her attire wasn't what she would have put on if she'd known he was coming. "Hello." Then his gaze ran up and down her body, stopping on her face. "Is this a bad time?" Yes, it kind of was, but since she'd been thinking about him the entire time she'd been cleaning, maybe it was a good thing he'd stopped by. And what was in that gift basket? She hadn't eaten yet, and it looked like it held some yummy food. "No, it's not a bad time." She stepped back and held the door open. "I was just about done cleaning." Which was true. She just had a few things left to dust, but that could wait. Nathan walked inside. Chloe closed the door behind him and shoved her cleaning supplies into the coat closet. Then she realized that this was the first time Nathan had been to her condo. "Nice place," he said as he glanced around. She was proud of how she'd taken the relatively small space and made it a reflection of her. "Thanks, I like it." Then she swept her hand toward the cream-colored couch. "Make yourself at home." "These are for you." He lifted the gift basket and the vase with a bouquet of flowers. "How lovely, thank you." She took the vase and set it in the center of the coffee table. Nathan set the gift basket on the coffee table as well. "Please have a seat." She pointed in the general direction of her bedroom. "If you'll give me a few minutes." "Of course." Chloe walked into her bedroom, closing the door behind her. Then she took the world's fastest shower before quickly making herself presentable. Then she went back out to the living room. Nathan was sitting on the couch, his phone in his hand, but the moment she walked in, he put his phone away. Chloe appreciated that. It seemed so often that it was hard to get people's full attention when they had their phone available. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she said, but with the gifts he'd brought, she kind of figured he'd come to talk about what had happened the day before, and so he probably wasn't in a hurry. "That's okay. I didn't give you any warning that I was coming." "Why didn't you?" She settled into a chair next to the couch, tucking her feet underneath her as she faced him. "Truth?" She grinned. "Always." With a wry smile, he said, "I didn't want to give you a chance to leave." Softly chuckling, she said, I'm kind of glad you resurrected truth. Nathan was too, because he had an important question that he needed answered, right now. Just to be sure we're on the same page, we ought to agree to always be honest, even if we don't invoke truth. Chloe bit her lower lip, but then she nodded. All right. You agree? I agree. Then, just to make it official, Nathan reached out his hand to shake on it. Chloe leaned forward and slid her hand into his, and when the smooth skin of her hand brushed against his, Nathan felt an unexpected jolt, kind of like he had when he kissed her. His focus was on her face, and he could have sworn he read something in those blue eyes of hers, something that reflected what he was feeling. She withdrew her hand and placed it in her lap. Ready to start the truth-telling immediately, Nathan said, Let's talk about that kiss. Chloe's eyes widened, and a blush flooded her cheeks. Nathan could see that this was a subject that was going to become very interesting very fast. What about it? She asked, blinking several times in an obvious attempt to gain control over her transparent reaction. First off, I apologize for doing something that was clearly unwanted. I was out of line. His statement was kind of a test to see how Chloe would respond. She'd just promised to be honest after all, had even shaken on it. Now Chloe knew why Nathan had pushed truth so hard. Then again, if he hadn't come out and asked her a specific question, she wouldn't have to say anything. I'm over it, she said, but as the words left her mouth, she knew that wasn't true at all. How could she say she was over it when it was all she'd been able to think about? Guilt at failing at their game swept over her. Are you? He asked, his eyebrows raised. Because I'm not. She grabbed onto this opportunity to dig a little deeper. Why not? A muscle moved in his jaw as he gazed at her. I'm confused. What are you confused about? He narrowed his eyes. About you, Chloe. About what you're feeling. Uh-oh, she thought. This subject line could only lead to trouble, because she was determined to get back on track with truth. Avoiding his eyes, Chloe reached for the basket on the coffee table. What do you have in here? I'm starving. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw his lips twist into a smirk as he shook his head. That was okay, as long as it deflected his train of thought. He opened the basket and took out paper-wrapped sandwiches, one marked California Club, the other marked roast beef. Then he took out a fruit salad, a potato salad, 2 small bags of chips, and 2 large chocolate chip cookies. All of your favorites. Nice. Chloe stood. Let me grab some plates and things. She went into the kitchen and gathered a few items, then brought them back to the living room. Why don't we take this out to my balcony? Sounds good. Nathan reloaded the picnic basket, then followed Chloe out the sliding door and onto her balcony. Once they'd arranged the food on the small balcony table and they were both seated, they began eating. Thank you for bringing lunch, Chloe said, hoping Nathan had forgotten the conversation they'd been having. Any time. He took a large bite of his sandwich, chewed and swallowed, then set the sandwich on his plate. Let's get back to my question. So much for distracting him with food. You never actually asked a question. He chuckled. Okay, I'll ask it now. Great, she thought. When I kissed you, I almost felt like I was kissing 2 different people. Not willing to make this any easier for him, Chloe munched on a chip before saying, I still didn't hear a question. Nathan laughed. Fine, you want me to come out and say it? I will. Oh no, what was she getting herself into? Afraid to provoke him any further, Chloe stayed silent. Did you really hate that I kissed you? Truth. A kaleidoscope of emotions swirled inside her. On the one hand, kissing him was a dream come true, but on the other, her feelings toward him were so unsettled, so wrapped up in her grief for Lisa, that it had been hard to truly enjoy that kiss. I haven't decided, she finally said. She knew that wasn't what he wanted to hear, but it seemed to be a good compromise for all of her feelings, and it was actually the truth. You know, he said, as he stabbed at a chunk of watermelon with his fork, I almost didn't come over this morning, but then I thought about how quickly life can change, and I knew I needed to come talk to you. Sadness and regret filled his eyes, and a muscle worked in his jaw. It seemed as if he was trying to get his emotions under control. Chloe's eyes were riveted to him. He cleared his throat. When I'd been on that island so long that I'd resigned myself to dying there, alone, I had an epiphany. Life's too short to cling to anger when you can be putting your energy into being happy instead. The profoundness of his statement jolted Chloe, not only because she knew he was right, but because it reminded her of the terrible things he'd been through. Still, in a corner of her mind was the memory of Lisa. Despite recognizing that her feelings toward Nathan had softened considerably, there were still barriers she had to break down. "What are you thinking?" Truth, she thought, truth. "Well," she began. Her eyes pointed toward the food in front of her. Then she met his gaze. "I get what you're saying, and I agree." Undisguised hope filled his eyes. Chloe held up one hand. "But—" Nathan's lips tugged downward. "But what?" "I need time, Nathan." Nathan thought Chloe had seemed moved by what he told her. She'd even said she agreed. It was time to push for more. Time to do what exactly? Chloe looked thoughtful, like she hadn't worked out exactly what needed to happen in order for her to forgive him. I don't know." She might not have any idea, but he had one. "Would you be willing to spend time with me?" She opened her mouth, but this time he put his hand up to stop her from speaking. "Hang on, let me finish." Her lips pressed into a tight line. "Maybe there's no hope," he began, truly hoping he was wrong. "But I'd like the opportunity to at least earn back your friendship, and the only way that's going to happen is if we spend time together. And I don't mean working on my house." He gestured toward her to let her know he was done talking. Chloe thought about what Nathan had said. Deep inside, she was desperate for things to go back to how they'd been, but she knew they never would. But maybe they didn't have to go back to how they'd been. Maybe she needed to stop looking backward and instead look forward to a new way of thinking, a new way of living. And really, who better to do it with than Nathan, the man who had been her best friend? "Okay," she finally said. "I'll do it." Elation swept over Nathan's face. "Really?" As she watched the relief and happiness play across his features, Chloe had no doubt that this was something that was immensely important to him. That alone spurred her on to commit fully to this. "Yes," she said, with a smile that felt wonderful. "Really." Chapter 23. Now what? Nathan had half expected her to refuse, so he hadn't actually thought beyond the moment. Was it too soon to tell her that he wanted more than friendship? Yeah, probably. One obstacle at a time. "Well," he said, his mind racing with ideas of things to do, "why don't we do something fun today?" For a brief moment, she had a deer-in-the-headlights look, as if she hadn't thought he would come up with something so soon. Then her expression smoothed out, which built his hopes that she was really going to try. "What did you have in mind?" What did he have in mind? Then he thought of something. "I'd love to take you out on an ATV." Her eyes widened. "Aren't those things dangerous?" "Not necessarily. We'll wear helmets and I won't go too fast." Her forehead creased with worry. "How about a hike instead?" As much as he wanted to push her to do something outside her comfort zone, he had to remember that her sister had died in an accident. Baby steps, he thought. Hiking it is. Relief flooded her face. All right. Glad that she'd come up with an alternate idea instead of turning him down flat, he said, "Day's wasting, so we should get going as soon as we're done eating." Chloe nodded, then picked up her sandwich and took a bite. They chatted about where they would go hiking, deciding on a place they'd hiked before. Then they talked about what they might see. "I hope we see a deer." Thrilled that she seemed excited about this date, Nathan wondered if she actually thought of it as a date. Deciding not to worry about the semantics, when they were done eating, he helped her clean up. Then they grabbed some water bottles from her fridge and placed them in a day pack Chloe pulled from a closet. "Next time I'll be better prepared," Nathan said with a small grimace. She smiled. "You weren't completely unprepared. You did bring that delicious lunch." He chuckled. "Don't forget the flowers." Laughing, she said, "Right." They walked out of Chloe's condo and toward Nathan's Lamborghini. Chloe stopped beside it and looked at him with raised eyebrows. "Maybe we should take my car, since we'll have to drive on a dirt road to get to the trailhead." She smirked. "Your car's not really meant for off-roading." Observing the low clearance of his car, Nathan had to agree. "That is true." "Alrighty then." She swept her arm toward the parking lot. "This way." He followed her to her car, a 4-door compact. They both got in, then Chloe turned on her car, backed out of her parking space, and headed out. As they parked at the trailhead, Chloe let the memories of the other time she'd been there wash over her. The other time she'd gone there with Nathan, Lisa had been there too. But to her surprise, instead of feeling terrible grief, she felt a deep melancholy. It was still something she wished she didn't have to feel at all, but it was a bit easier to deal with than the crippling grief she'd come to expect. They climbed out of her car, and with their water bottles in the pack on Nathan's back, they set off. "Do you remember the last time we came here?" Chloe stared at the dirt-packed ground as they walked, working to recall when they had last been there. She turned to Nathan. "Wasn't it a few weeks before you and I graduated college?" "That's what I remember." It had been her and Nathan and a few of their other friends, and Lisa. Life had been completely different then. The future had stretched out in front of them, full of promise. Kind of incredible how much had changed since then. She needed to stop dwelling on the past. She knew that, and yet it took an effort to turn her mind away from the past and focus on the here and now. Nathan's phone rang in his pocket. Glad for the distraction, when he ignored it, she looked at him with surprise. "Aren't you going to get that?" His lips turned up in a smile. "Why? Do you think it could be something important?" "I have no idea." Softly chuckling, he shook his head, and eventually the ringing stopped. He smiled at her. "Better?" It was hard for Chloe to ignore her phone when it rang, or even if a text came in. It was like she had to check it. What if it was important? "You never used to ignore your phone." She shook her head. "Even when we went to a movie, you'd check your phone." She laughed, "Except that one time someone yelled at you to put your phone away. That time you actually left the theater to see who was calling." She narrowed her eyes. "What's your secret now?" "My secret?" Chloe stopped walking, so Nathan stopped as well. "Yeah, you don't seem at all bothered by the fact that you could have missed a super important phone call." To her surprise, he reached out and took her hands as he faced her. "What could possibly be more important than being with you?" As his eyes locked on hers, and the deep timbre of his voice filled the space between them, Chloe's pulse skyrocketed. The moment was suddenly too intense, and she scrambled to come up with something to say that would lighten the mood. What if it was the police calling to say someone had stolen your car? Nathan's shoulders lifted in a shrug as a carefree look came across his face. "It's just a car." Then he smirked. "Besides, there wouldn't be anything I could do, would there? So why get upset over it?" Chloe thought about the time Nathan had parked in a no-parking zone, and his Range Rover had been towed. He'd thought it had been stolen, and he'd totally freaked out. This Nathan was nothing like that. "You've changed," she said, kind of astonished at the truth of it. A bark of laughter left his mouth. "You just noticed? Because I've been trying to tell you that ever since I got home." Slowly nodding, Chloe turned her body to indicate that she wanted to keep walking, and hand in hand, they continued on, their steps unhurried. This Nathan, easygoing, wanting to please her, genuinely caring, and still supremely hot. She liked him, more than she ever had before. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, as they walked along the shady trail. Chloe turned and looked at him, her heart skipping a beat to know he was into her. She'd been crazy about him for years, and had only dreamed he would feel the same. Now, though, with their fingers intertwined and his attention completely on her, she felt a happiness she hadn't felt, well, ever. "I'm thinking," she began, "that being stuck on an island all by yourself obviously made you reconsider what's really important." A wry smile curved his lips. "Now you're getting it." Realizing that her thoughts were not automatically going to Lisa like they usually did when thinking about Nathan and the cruise, Chloe knew she was actually starting to move past her grief and anger. A sense of relief that she might be able to get on with her life swept over her, and she softly exhaled as peace filled her soul. Then her thoughts turned to what it must have been like for Nathan, all alone and not knowing if he would live to see another day. "How did you survive?" she asked as she gazed at him, her voice soft. "On that island?" Nathan got a faraway look as he turned to face the direction they were going. Maybe she shouldn't have asked. Maybe the memories were too painful. If she was stuck on an island in the middle of the ocean and had to survive by her wits, she wouldn't have made it. Studying Nathan's profile as he stared into the distance, it hit her. He was as prone to mistakes and fallibility as anyone else. He was just as human as she was. Yet he had survived for a year, all alone on an island. He was incredible. Chapter 24. This was the first time when someone had asked about his experience that Nathan actually wanted to give an answer. With Chloe's hand in his, he felt such a connection to her that he wanted her to know his every thought and feeling. "You don't have to tell me," she said, her voice soft and her expression tender. "No," he said, as a smile slowly curved his lips. "I want to." She smiled back, a smile filled with a warmth he hadn't seen on her face since he'd returned home. She was softening toward him. He had no doubt, and it thrilled him. There had been a shift in their relationship, a shift in the right direction, a shift that he'd been working toward from the moment he'd laid eyes on her several weeks earlier. Right then, it felt as if they were the only two people in the world. It almost reminded him of how he'd felt on the island, except for one major difference. This time, Chloe was with him, and she was the only person in the world he wanted to be with. He imagined what it would have been like to be stranded on the island with her. It wouldn't have been the torture he'd experienced. It would have been paradise. Now, as he looked into Chloe's sky-blue eyes, he felt a closeness to her that he'd never felt with another living soul, ever. That's when he knew. He was in love with her. Stunned, he completely forgot about the question she just asked, and instead focused on what he was feeling in that moment. The warmth of his love for her, the softness of her hand in his, the comfort of her presence beside him. It felt so good and so right. She'd been his best friend for what felt like forever. But now he wanted something much deeper than friendship. He just hoped she would eventually feel the same. Gazing at her sweet face, he wanted to blurt out his feelings, but after the work it had taken to get to this point, he didn't want to scare her away. Instead, he would bide his time and wait for the right moment. "Let's sit," he said, as he scanned the area. A grouping of large boulders was nestled off to the side of the trail. Nathan led Chloe to them before releasing her hand so they could face each other as they sat. "Before you start, I just have to say—" She shook her head. "Without even knowing what you dealt with, I think you're incredible. For surviving against what must have been unbelievable odds." Her words filled him with peace, not only because of the admiration she plainly felt, but because he could sense that she was beginning to forgive him for Lisa's death. Then he knew. Until she forgave him, he would never be able to forgive himself. He needed her forgiveness, desperately. But he had to earn it, had to prove himself worthy of it. He could only hope she would find it in her heart to forgive him. "Thank you. I appreciate that." He drew in a deep breath before slowly releasing it, then thought, where to begin? Chloe made herself comfortable on the boulder and listened as Nathan told her about what he'd been through. Sleeping on the beach until he'd found a cave to use as shelter, finding a safe source of water, developing his fishing skills, climbing trees to get their fruit, and watching every single day for a ship or a boat to come close enough for him to light the ever-ready signal bonfire. Listening to him describe his experience, Chloe was speechless. Then she remembered how she'd secretly scoffed at him tearing out the wall on his house. It must have been a simple thing to do after all he'd been through, and she felt humbled. I just wish I'd been more forceful in not letting Lisa go on that cruise. But you know your sister. When she wanted something, it was hard to deny her. Wait, she thought. What? She tilted her head and narrowed her eyes. Hold on. Her tone was filled with confusion. What are you talking about? You invited her to go with you. Now it was Nathan's turn to look confused. No, I didn't. This was a trip I wanted to take by myself, so I could have time to think about my future. Lisa invited herself. I told her no, but she pushed and pushed until I relented. Stunned by this news, Chloe felt her mouth fall open. All this time, she'd believed that Nathan had invited Lisa, had chosen Lisa, over her. She'd completely blamed him for Lisa's death for that very reason. But that wasn't the case at all. He'd actually discouraged Lisa from coming. Truth? She asked, her voice shaking. Truth, he said, his forehead furrowed, like he didn't know why this was news to her. Wait, you thought I invited Lisa to come with me? Nodding dumbly, Chloe felt her world shifting. Everything she had believed had been wrong. Why would I do that? Why would I invite her and not you? That makes no sense. Then his face paled. What if I had invited both of you? You'd both be... Grief bracketed his eyes, and his voice dropped to a whisper. You'd both be dead. He took a deep, pained breath and closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they had a haunted look. Voice cracking, he said, I'd be responsible for destroying your entire family. In complete silence, Chloe watched all kinds of emotions play across Nathan's face. Guilt, sorrow, regret. She'd been holding Lisa's death against him when he was completely innocent. Lisa had insisted on coming. Nathan held zero responsibility for her death. Then she remembered what she told him at his party, the party to celebrate the fact that he was alive. She'd flat out told him that Lisa's death was his fault, and he'd taken it without flinching. Sorrow, dark and powerful, pierced Chloe to the depths of her soul. This whole time, Nathan had been suffering guilt and grief when he should have been celebrating that he'd lived. All he'd wanted was Chloe's forgiveness, and she had denied him that. Fresh grief nearly swallowed her. But this grief was different than the grief she'd had for Lisa. This new grief was for the pain she'd inflicted upon Nathan when he hadn't deserved one drop of it. Tears flooded her eyes, and she reached out for Nathan, taking his hands in hers. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice shaking and her tone filled with pleading. Can you ever forgive me? Nathan's gray eyes snapped to hers. Forgive you? For what? He shook his head. You haven't done anything wrong. Then guilt filled his eyes once again. His chin quivered, but he kept it together. I need your forgiveness, Chloe, for taking your sister away. Before he'd even finished speaking, Chloe was shaking her head from side to side in a strong gesture of refusal. It wasn't your fault, Nathan. Stop blaming yourself. She swallowed over the knot in her throat. I was wrong to blame you. I'm so sorry. Nathan's jaw clenched as he shook his head. I shouldn't have let her come. If I had been stronger, she would still be alive. Chloe couldn't stand it a second longer. She moved to Nathan's side, sitting beside him on the rock and locking her eyes with his. Stop it. I don't blame you. I never should have. You did nothing wrong, Nathan. Nothing. He stared at her as if he was trying to process her shift from blaming him to absolving him of all responsibility. His gaze fell to his lap before he lifted it to meet her eyes. Are you saying you forgive me? The depths of despair she saw in his eyes tore at her heart. He'd suffered more than any one person should have to suffer, and if all he wanted was her forgiveness, then it was up to her to make things right. She placed her hands on both sides of his face and locked her eyes with his, gazing at him as her love for him nearly overwhelmed her. He was such a good man, and he was still her best friend. How could she have nearly thrown that away? Stunned to realize how close she had come to making the biggest mistake of her life, she said, "There's nothing to forgive, Nathan, but if you need me to say it, I will. I forgive you completely, and I don't blame you for Lisa's death." Nathan's countenance brightened, as if all the despair he'd been feeling had washed away, and Chloe felt an answering glow in her own soul. She had really and truly forgiven Nathan, and it felt magnificent. She hadn't felt this light and joyful since before Nathan and Lisa had left on that cruise. She released Nathan's face, but before her hands had reached her lap, he took them in his. "Thank you, Chloe. That's what I needed to hear." As she gazed into his eyes that were filled with a serenity she had never seen before, her heart swelled with an overwhelming love for him. She had always crushed on him, but her feelings had grown and matured, and she had to tell him, couldn't hold back her feelings even if she wanted to. "I love you, Nathan." His eyes widened, and for a moment she wondered if telling him had been a mistake. But no, he needed to know how she felt. Then his lips tilted into a half-smile. "You mean as a friend, right?" She could understand why he was asking that. They'd been friends for years, and besides him kissing her the day before, there had never been anything remotely romantic between them. But no, that wasn't what she meant, and even though it was kind of scary to admit it, she was going to. "No," she said, as a smile blossomed on her lips. "I don't mean as a friend." Then her smile grew even more. "Truth." A deep chuckle slipped out of his mouth. "That's interesting." Her smile dimmed. Maybe she should have kept her feelings to herself. Had she just ruined their friendship? But she knew he had to feel something beyond friendship for her. After all, he'd kissed her. "Why is that interesting?" His smile brightened, and then he released one of her hands before stroking her cheek. "Because I love you too." Chloe's heart did a kind of ker-thump. Did he mean it? Did he really feel toward her as she felt toward him? She had to clarify. "Not as a friend?" He leaned closer to her and murmured, "Truth, not as a friend." Then he nearly closed the distance between their mouths, stopping an inch away. "If I kiss you, will you slap me?" Desperate to have his lips on hers, she whispered, "No." At that, his lips crushed hers, and his arms went around her waist. Chloe slid her arms around his neck and held him against her, savoring the feel of him. He was the man she was in love with and had been for so long, and he was the man who loved her right back. After a lingering kiss, he drew away and smiled at her. "I hope it's not going to be a problem if I want to kiss you when we're working on my house." She thought about how embarrassed she'd been when Keith had caught Nathan kissing her and then had seen her slapping him. But now that they had declared their love for each other, she didn't care who knew. "No," she said with a smirk, "you can kiss me whenever you want." His smile grew. "Good." Then he kissed her again. Chloe sank against him as a deep contentment settled over her. She still missed Lisa terribly, and always would. But now that she'd released Nathan from all responsibility, the anger she'd been harboring melted away. Her future held all kinds of promise, something she'd nearly given up hoping for, and having Nathan in love with her had been so beyond her wildest dreams that she soaked up every drop of this wonderful moment. He loved her, and she loved him, and Chloe had no doubt that they would be together forever. Chapter 25. 8 months later. "Are you sure you're ready for the big reveal?" Chloe asked as she and Nathan drove to his house. She was driving his Lamborghini because she'd made him wear a blindfold. He chuckled. "I've never been so ready for anything in my life." He turned toward her, and when Chloe looked at the blindfold covering his eyes as he faced her, she worked to suppress a laugh. "Believe it or not, my parents actually seem ready to see me go." The laughter wouldn't be stopped and made its way right up her throat before bursting from her mouth. Nathan lifted a corner of the blindfold, and when Chloe saw one of his gray eyes peeking out, she laughed harder. Grinning, he said, "Are you laughing at what I said about my parents, or are you laughing at me?" Pressing one hand to her mouth in a failed attempt to keep the giggles inside, she glanced at him. "You! I'm laughing at you!" He tore the blindfold off and gave her a look that said he was done looking silly. Chloe's eyes widened as she gasped in mock distress. Then she pulled onto a side street, stopping at the curb. Nathan looked around. "What are you doing? This isn't my house." Struggling to hold back another burst of giggles, she said, "We're not going anywhere until you put that blindfold back on." Nathan reached out and put his hand over hers. "I love you, Chloe, but there are limits to what I'll do." Seeing the sincerity in his face filled her with joy. At least once a day he told her he loved her, but she never tired of hearing it. "Fine," she said with a smirk. "You can leave the blindfold off if you promise to close your eyes when I tell you to." "Deal." They continued on, and when they turned onto Nathan's street, she told him to close his eyes. Making sure his eyes were shut tight, she drove to his house, stopping where they would be able to see the entire front of the property. He hadn't been there for weeks. She'd made him promise to stay away while she finished, and she was beyond excited to show him the finished project. "Okay," she said with a huge smile. "You can open your eyes." Obediently, Nathan opened his eyes, and when he saw the front of his house, his lips stretched into a wide smile. Though he hadn't been sure how he wanted the house to look, he loved what Chloe had done with it, and that was before they'd even gone inside. "Well?" she asked from the driver's seat, her voice tinged with anxiety. "What do you think?" He turned to her with a grin. "I love it." Even more, he loved her. So deeply and fully that he often felt like his heart would burst from it. "Truth?" "Yes. Now let's go inside so I can see the rest." A few moments later, they stepped over the threshold, and Nathan was blown away by how amazing the place looked. They walked from room to room, with Chloe pointing out details here and there. He was so in love with her, but he also had great respect for her and her talents. Then he thought about the little surprise he had for her, and could barely contain the giddy excitement that threatened to overtake him. They finished their tour, ending in the backyard. They stood on the patio under the coffered ceiling. He turned to her and took her hands in his. "I am so impressed with you. This house turned out so much better than I could ever have imagined. I absolutely love it." He smiled softly. "Chloe, you're amazing." Her face practically glowed under his praise. Chloe felt as if she was lit from within. Even though she was proud of the work she'd done, she'd been so worried that Nathan wouldn't like it that she'd hardly slept the night before. But now, hearing how much he loved it, relief cascaded over her in waves. She'd done it. She'd created the perfect house for the man she loved. He led her to a love seat that offered a panoramic view of the green hills. They sat side by side. "There is one thing that's missing, though," he said with a frown. Heart pounding, Chloe frantically tried to figure out what she'd forgotten. "What? What's missing?" Nathan's lips tugged upward as he took her hands. "You." Uncertain what he meant, Chloe shook her head. "I don't understand." "Now that my house is done," he said, his gaze soft on hers, "and I'm going to move in, one very important element is missing." He studied her as if he was looking into her very soul. "I love you more than anything in this world, Chloe." Her eyes widened. Was he about to do what she thought he was? Her heart thundered with anticipation as she gazed at him. She loved him so much, more than she ever thought she could love another human being. Whenever she thought about how close she'd come to throwing her relationship with him away, she nearly lost her breath. But now, with him appraising her with love-filled eyes, she savored the moment. "I love you too," she whispered, "so much." "That's good." His voice had a lilt to it, like he was holding back powerful emotions. "Because now I'm more confident in what your answer will be." "My answer?" "Yes." Laughing, she said, "You haven't even asked a question yet." "Let's play truth." The anticipation was killing her, but she played along. "Okay." "I'll go first." She was silent as she waited to hear his question. "Would you love me, even if I was dirt poor?" She answered without hesitation, "Yes." Then a fresh worry filled her mind and she frowned. "Did I spend too much on the remodel?" Shaking his head, he chuckled. "No." Then he sobered. But if I had to sell this house, how would you feel? Sadness, bright and swift, crashed over her. She would be devastated. She'd poured her heart and soul into this project. But as she looked at Nathan and thought about the priorities they shared, relationships and people over temporal things, the feeling of devastation faded. I would be sad for sure, but I would get over it. She smiled. Eventually. How would you feel about living here? Wait, what was he implying? Had she misunderstood where this conversation was leading? Was he asking her to move in with him? Because that wasn't something she was willing to do. Anxious now, she waited to hear what he had to say. A smile slowly lifted his lips. Chloe, you own my heart, and there's nothing I want more than to spend the rest of my life with you. He paused a beat. Will you marry me? He wanted to marry her. He wanted her to be his wife. Pure happiness rushed through her. Marrying him was exactly what she wanted. Nearly exploding with joy, she threw her arms around him. Yes, she said through her tears. Yes, I will marry you. He held her in his arms, and she relished the love that radiated from him. I have something for you, he said as he drew away. What more could she want than to marry him? Anxious for him to know that he'd already given her all that she desired, she said, I don't need anything else. He chuckled as he reached into his pocket before withdrawing his hand, his fingers curled into a fist as if he was holding something. You may not need anything else, but this is kind of traditional. Then he unfurled his fingers to reveal a huge, sparkling diamond ring. Oh, Chloe breathed out, it's so beautiful. He took her left hand in his and slid the ring onto her ring finger. It fit perfectly. Chloe admired it, but only for a moment, because all she really needed was Nathan by her side. I love you, she said as she smiled at him. He wrapped his arms around her. I love you too. She snuggled against him, happier than she ever thought she would be, and excited to begin her future with the love of her life. This has been The Missing Billionaire, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2019 by Christine Kersey. Thanks for listening.